Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The scream echoed through the dark forest, chilling me to the bone. I'd heard plenty of animal calls in my years as a park ranger, but this was different. It was primal, desperate, and unmistakably human. I gripped my flashlight tighter, its beam cutting through the misty darkness as I made my way deeper into the woods. The night shift was usually uneventful. Check the campsites, make sure no one was breaking park rules, maybe chase off a raccoon or two, but tonight was different. That scream changed everything. My radio crackled to life. "Pete, you copy? Everything okay out there?" It was Sarah, my fellow ranger back at headquarters. "Yeah, I copy," I replied, trying to keep the tension out of my voice. "Heard something strange. I'm going to check it out." "Be careful," Sarah warned. "Want me to send backup?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes, to have someone watching my back. But I'd been doing this job for 15 years. I could handle myself. "Negative," I said. "I'll radio if I need help. Over and out." I clicked off the radio and paused, listening intently. The forest was eerily quiet now, as if holding its breath. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting. Just the soft rustle of leaves in the cool night breeze. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, searching for any sign of disturbance. That's when I saw them, footprints in the soft earth of the trail. Big footprints, way too big to be human. My heart rate quickened as I knelt to examine them. The impressions were deep, suggesting whatever made them was heavy. The shape was vaguely human-like, but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen prints like these. Bears, cougars, deer. I knew them all, but this was something else entirely. I stood slowly, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air. Logic told me to radio for backup, to wait for help before proceeding. But curiosity and a sense of duty pushed me forward. What if someone was hurt out here? I couldn't just leave them. So I pressed on, following the strange tracks deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, scraping against my jacket. My flashlight beam seemed to grow weaker, struggling to penetrate the thick darkness. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the silent woods. But eventually, I came to a small clearing. The tracks led straight to the center where they suddenly vanished. Confused, I swept my light around the area. That's when I saw it, a dark, hulking shape at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, I thought it was a bear, but as my light fell upon it, I realized with a jolt of fear that it was standing on 2 legs. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, covered in dark fur, with a massive barrel-shaped chest and arms that hung nearly to the ground. Its head was oddly shaped, somewhere between human and animal, with a protruding snout and eyes that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm, but I knew deep down it would be useless against this creature. Its muscles rippled beneath its fur as it breathed, each exhale sending a plume of steam into the cold night air. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and flee. But I stood my ground, rooted to the spot by a mixture of fear and awe. Slowly, deliberately, the creature raised one massive hand. I flinched, expecting an attack, but instead it pointed behind me, back the way I had come. Then it let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. The message was clear. "Go back. This is not your place." I didn't need to be told twice. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the creature. It watched me go, its gaze burning into me even as the darkness swallowed it up. I'd like to say I made it back to my truck with dignity, but the truth is, I ran most of the way. I stumbled through the forest, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning as I gulped in the cold night air. When I finally reached the ranger station, I was a mess. Sarah took one look at me and immediately called for backup. I managed to stammer out some of what happened, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The next day, a search team combed the area where I'd had my encounter. They found the footprints, took casts and photographs, but there was no sign of the creature itself, no fur samples, no droppings, nothing to prove what I'd seen was real. The official report chalked it up to a bear sighting and possible hallucinations brought on by stress and fatigue. My colleagues were sympathetic, but skeptical. I heard the whispers, saw the sidelong glances. Old Pete's losing it, they said. Too many nights alone in the woods. But I know what I saw. In the years since, I've heard stories from hikers and campers, strange noises in the night, glimpses of something large moving through the trees. Most folks laugh it off, attribute it to an overactive imagination. But sometimes I see a look in their eyes, a mix of fear and wonder that mirrors what I felt that night. I still work as a ranger, still do the night patrols, but I'm more cautious now. I pay attention to the silences, to the moments when the forest goes quiet, and sometimes, on dark nights when the mist rolls in, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I've never seen the creature again, and part of me hopes I never do. But a smaller, more primal part of me longs for another encounter, to know for sure that I'm not crazy, that there are still mysteries in this world yet to be explained. So I keep watching, keep listening, and I wonder what else is out there in the darkness, just beyond the reach of our flashlights and our understanding. What secrets does the forest hold when we're not looking? One thing's for sure. I'll never forget that night, or the creature I saw. It changed me, changed how I see the world. And sometimes, late at night when the wind whispers through the trees, I swear I can hear that low, rumbling growl. A reminder that we don't know everything, that there are still wonders and terrors lurking in the wild places of the world, and maybe, just maybe, that's how it should be. Story 2. The silence in the woods was unnerving. I had worked as a park ranger for 5 years now, and I'd learned to appreciate the natural sounds of the forest at night. Rustling leaves, distant hoots from owls, the occasional howls from wolves. But that night, there was none of that. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the trees were holding their breath. I had never experienced anything like it. It started just after sundown. I was doing my usual patrol, walking through the familiar paths around the ranger station. I was assigned to a relatively remote area of the park, a stretch of dense forest with very few visitors, especially this time of year. Fall was settling in, and the temperatures had dropped enough to keep most casual hikers away. Honestly, I liked it that way. The solitude was peaceful, and the job gave me time to think, reflect, and enjoy the beauty of nature. But that night, as I walked back toward the station, something felt off. At first, it was subtle, just the absence of sounds. No wind, no animals. It was as if the entire forest had gone still, waiting. I paused, turning my head slightly, listening. My boots crunched softly on the gravel path beneath me, but that was it. Nothing else. I shook my head, laughing it off. I'd been out here long enough to know that sometimes the woods could play tricks on you. Maybe it was a predator in the area, and the smaller animals had gone quiet, or maybe my imagination was getting the better of me. Either way, I shrugged it off and kept walking. The path ahead was dark, even with my flashlight cutting through the gloom. My breath misted in front of me as I exhaled, the cold air biting at my face. I was almost to the station when I heard it, a deep, resonant thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I stopped, shining my flashlight around. The beam danced over the trees, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move in the corners of my vision. But I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The sound had come from somewhere to my left, deeper into the woods. Another thud. This time, it was closer. My heartbeat quickened as I strained my ears to pick up any other noises. I could feel the tension in the air, like the forest was holding a secret just out of reach. I debated whether to investigate. Protocol said to report anything unusual, but I wasn't eager to stumble through the dark woods, chasing after sounds that could easily be explained. A falling tree limb, maybe. But then again, the weight behind the noise, whatever it was, didn't feel right. Still, curiosity won out, and I turned off the path, heading in the direction of the sound. The ground beneath me was softer here, damp leaves squelching underfoot as I moved between the trees. The flashlight beam flickered slightly, which made me curse under my breath. Of all the times for the damn thing to act up. I pushed forward, the trees thickening around me. The sound came again, closer still, and now there was something else. A heavy breathing, low, rhythmic, like something massive exhaling slowly. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively reached for the radio on my belt. Static greeted me as I tried to contact the station. "This is Ranger Wilson. Do you copy?" I whispered, not entirely sure why I was speaking so quietly. The silence around me felt like it demanded it. No response, just static. I swallowed hard, shining the light ahead again. That's when I saw it. The beam of my flashlight landed on the ground in front of me, illuminating a set of tracks. Big tracks. They were unmistakably bipedal, and the sheer size of them made my blood run cold. Each print was at least twice the size of my boot, the edges sunk deep into the wet earth. I knelt down, my breath catching in my throat as I traced the outline with the beam. They weren't bear tracks, that much was clear. I'd seen bear tracks before, and they weren't anything like this. These were long, with toes that dug into the earth, almost like human feet, but grotesquely larger. For a moment, I considered turning back. Whatever had made these tracks was big, and it wasn't something I wanted to cross paths with, but my curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I followed the tracks deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around me as I moved, the dense underbrush making it harder to navigate. My flashlight flickered again, and I slapped it lightly, willing it to stay on. The tracks led me to a small clearing, and as I stepped into the open space, I froze. At the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my light, stood a massive figure. I couldn't make out details, just a hulking silhouette, towering at least 7 or 8 feet tall. It stood perfectly still, watching me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first, I thought it might be a tree or some kind of optical illusion, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became. This was no tree. The thing shifted slightly, and I caught the faintest glimmer of eyes reflecting in the darkness. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the small knife at my belt. Not that it would do much good against something like that. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like a silent standoff, me frozen in place, and this thing standing just at the edge of my light. Then, without warning, it moved. Not towards me. No, it turned and disappeared into the trees with a speed that defied its size. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. I stood there, heart racing, trying to process what had just happened. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but somehow I managed to force myself to move. I backed away slowly, not daring to turn my back to the woods until I was sure I was far enough from the clearing. Once I was back on the main trail, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the station, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed the door behind me, locking it out of pure instinct. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the radio again, trying once more to contact anyone. The static was still there, but now it was interspersed with faint, garbled voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but at least I wasn't completely cut off. I slumped into the chair by the window, staring out into the dark woods, waiting for something to move, for something to follow me. But the night was still, too still. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the building, every rustle of wind outside made me jump. I kept the lights on, the door locked, and my eyes glued to the window. Whatever had been out there, whatever I had seen, it wasn't just some figment of my imagination. The next morning, I ventured outside, more cautiously this time. The tracks were gone. There were no signs of the creature, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Just the same quiet forest that I'd always known, but I knew better. I had seen it, I had felt its presence, and though I never spoke of it to anyone, who would believe me anyway, I knew that the forest held secrets, secrets that I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. From that night on, every patrol felt different. The woods, once so familiar, now seemed alien. I kept my eyes sharp, always listening for that heavy breathing, always scanning the treetops for movement. Whatever was out there was still watching. I could feel it, and the silence. It was no longer comforting. It was a warning. Story 3. The sound of claws scraping against nylon jolted me awake. My heart pounded as I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, straining my ears in the darkness. There it was again. A low, huffing breath just inches from my head, separated only by the thin fabric of our tent. This was the camping trip I'd always dreamed of, but now it was quickly turning into a nightmare. It had all started so perfectly. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 kids, Ethan and Lily, had been planning this trip for months. We wanted to get away from it all. No phones, no internet, just us and the great outdoors. We chose a remote campsite in the Cascade Mountains, known for its pristine wilderness and, yes, its healthy bear population, but we weren't worried. We'd done our research, bought a bear-proof food canister, and felt prepared for anything nature might throw at us. The first 2 days were idyllic. We hiked through lush forests, marveled at cascading waterfalls, and spent our evenings roasting marshmallows around the campfire. Ethan, at 12, was in his element, proudly showing off the knots he'd learned in Boy Scouts. 9-year-old Lily collected colorful rocks and insisted on giving each one a name. Sarah and I exchanged contented smiles over their heads, congratulating ourselves on this perfect family getaway. On the 3rd night, we tucked the kids into their sleeping bags in one side of the tent, while Sarah and I settled into the other. The sounds of the forest lulled us to sleep. The gentle rustle of wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the burbling of a nearby stream. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when the noise woke me. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it was Ethan or Lily getting up to use the bathroom, but as my mind cleared, I realized with growing dread that the sound was coming from outside the tent. Something big was out there. Something that shouldn't be this close to our campsite. I reached out in the darkness, my hand finding Sarah's arm. She was awake too, her body tense beside me. We lay there, barely breathing, as the creature outside continued to move around our tent. "The food," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did we put everything in the canister?" My blood ran cold as I remembered. In our rush to get the campfire going for s'mores, we'd left a bag of marshmallows out. It was sitting on the picnic table, not 10 feet from our tent. The scratching sound moved towards the front of the tent, near where the kids were sleeping. I heard Lily whimper softly, and Ethan's sleeping bag rustle as he woke up. "Dad!" Ethan's voice was small and frightened. "What's that noise?" "Shh," I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's okay. Just stay very still and quiet." I could feel Sarah trembling beside me. We'd talked about what to do in this situation, but now that it was happening, all our carefully laid plans seemed to evaporate. The creature outside let out a low grunt, followed by the sound of sniffing. It was investigating the tent, probably drawn by the lingering scent of the marshmallows on our clothes and breath. I knew I had to do something. If the bear, and I was pretty sure it was a bear at this point, decided to come into the tent, we'd be in real danger. But if I startled it, that could be just as bad. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped my sleeping bag. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "I have to try to scare it off," I whispered back. "Just stay here with the kids. No matter what happens, don't come out unless I tell you it's safe." I could see the fear in her eyes, even in the darkness of the tent, but she nodded, understanding that we didn't have many options. I crawled towards the tent entrance, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the bear must be able to hear it. As I reached for the zipper, I heard another grunt, closer this time. The bear was right outside the door. Taking a deep breath, I quickly unzipped the tent and burst out, waving my arms and yelling as loudly as I could, "Hey, get out of here! Go on! Get!" In the dim moonlight, I could make out the massive form of the bear. It was even bigger than I'd imagined, its shoulders easily coming up to my chest. For a moment we both froze, startled by each other's sudden appearance. Then the bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over me. A primal fear, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before, coursed through my body. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that would be the worst thing I could do. Instead, I stood my ground, continuing to shout and make myself look as big as possible. "Get out of here! Go on, beat it!" The bear dropped back to all fours, swaying slightly as it considered me. I could hear my family's frightened breathing from inside the tent, and I knew I had to protect them at all costs. Slowly, never taking my eyes off the bear, I backed up towards the picnic table. My hand fumbled behind me until I found the marshmallow bag. In one swift motion, I grabbed it and hurled it as far as I could into the woods. The bear's head swiveled, following the arc of the bag. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it might charge me. But then, with surprising speed for such a large animal, it lumbered off in the direction of the marshmallows. I stood there, shaking, as I watched the bear disappear into the darkness. Only when I could no longer hear it crashing through the underbrush did I allow myself to relax slightly. "Is it gone?" Sarah's voice came from the tent, quavering with fear. "I think so," I replied, my own voice unsteady. "But we need to pack up, now. We can't stay here." The next hour was a blur of activity. We hurriedly packed our gear, constantly scanning the darkness for any sign of the bear's return. The kids were wide-eyed and silent, sensing the gravity of the situation. By the time we had everything loaded into our SUV, the eastern sky was starting to lighten. As we drove down the winding mountain road, the first rays of sun peeking over the horizon, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. We'd been careless. One simple mistake, leaving food out, had put us all in danger. It was a sobering reminder of the power and unpredictability of nature. As we reached the ranger station at the park entrance, I pulled over. The kids had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the night's excitement. Sarah reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "You saved us," she said softly. I shook my head. "I almost got us killed. If I'd just remembered to put away the marshmallows." "Hey," she cut me off. "We're all okay. That's what matters. And next time, we'll be better prepared." I looked at her in surprise. "Next time? You want to go camping again after this?" She smiled, a hint of adventure gleaming in her eyes. "Of course. But maybe somewhere with fewer bears next time." I couldn't help but laugh, feeling the tension of the night finally start to dissipate. As I watched the sun rise over the mountains, I realized that this trip, terrifying as it had been, had taught us all something valuable: respect for nature, the importance of preparation, and the strength we could find as a family when faced with adversity. We'd come seeking adventure in the wilderness, and we'd certainly found it, just not in the way we'd expected. As we pulled back onto the road, heading home with a story we'd be telling for years to come, I knew that our love for the outdoors hadn't been diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered now with a newfound wisdom and respect. The bear encounter would always be a part of us, a reminder of the wild heart that still beats in the world around us. And while I hoped we'd never have such a close call again, I was grateful for the lesson it had taught us. In the end, isn't that what adventures are all about? Story 4. The forest had always been my refuge, a place where I could get away from everything and everyone. No city noise, no endless demands, no distractions. Just the quiet peace of nature, the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the trail, and the steady pulse of my own thoughts. But that day, the woods felt different. The sense of solitude I usually craved had morphed into something heavier, something that sat on my shoulders like a weight. I'd been hiking for hours, deep into a part of the forest that wasn't well traveled. It wasn't an official trail, but I had wandered this area plenty of times before. My pack was light, and I had just enough supplies for a day out, maybe a night if I needed it. I didn't plan on seeing anyone out here. That's why I liked it. But as the afternoon crept on, a creeping feeling of unease settled in. It started small, barely noticeable, like the sensation of being watched, a prickling on the back of my neck. I shook it off at first. It's easy to get paranoid when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. The mind plays tricks. Then I heard it. A branch snapped behind me, loud and clear. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I turned slowly, scanning the forest. The trees loomed tall and dark, their shadows stretching across the ground as the sun began to sink lower. Nothing moved, but the sound had been real, too close to be from a falling limb. I stood there, listening, waiting for more. But the forest had gone eerily still, as if whatever had made the noise was holding its breath, waiting for me to move. I wasn't sure whether to laugh at myself or to be genuinely concerned. Maybe a deer, I thought, or some other animal foraging in the underbrush. It wouldn't be the first time wildlife had startled me. I kept walking, but my pace quickened slightly. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but something about the air felt wrong now. Thick, tense. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. My ears strained to catch every sound, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement, just a shadow at first, maybe 50 feet behind me, slipping between the trees. My breath hitched, and I stopped dead in my tracks, whipping around to get a better look. There was nothing there now, just the same stretch of forest, empty and still. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had been there, moving just at the edge of my sightline. I stood frozen for a few moments, staring at the spot where I thought I'd seen movement. I told myself again that it was probably an animal, a big animal, sure, but nothing unusual for this deep in the woods. Still, the unease gnawed at me, a low, insistent thrum in the back of my mind. Something was off. I took a deep breath and turned back toward the trail, deciding it was time to start heading back. The day was getting late, and I didn't want to be out here after dark, especially not with this weird feeling creeping up on me. But after only a few steps, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, crushing the underbrush behind me. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I caught a glimpse of something, tall, dark and impossibly fast, darting between the trees. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal. It was too big, and it was on 2 legs. "Hello," I called out, my voice shakier than I'd intended. Silence. I waited for a response, for some sign that it was just another hiker, maybe someone lost or playing a prank. But the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. The forest swallowed my voice, and I was alone again. But not really alone. That feeling of being watched was now unbearable, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I knew that panicking in the wilderness could lead to stupid decisions. I needed to stay calm, keep my wits about me. I took a step backward, then another, my eyes scanning the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows that made everything look distorted and unfamiliar. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following me, tracking my every move. I forced myself to turn back to the trail and walk, but my pace quickened, my legs trembling with the urge to break into a run. The footsteps behind me continued, just far enough away that I couldn't see who or what was making them, but close enough to make my skin crawl. Every few steps, I heard the crunch of leaves and twigs, echoing mine, but always a beat behind. I picked up the pace, my heart hammering in my chest. My breath came faster now, more ragged as my adrenaline spiked. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees looming larger, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. I slowed to a halt, panting, my pulse thudding in my ears. I turned around, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand as I scanned the dense forest behind me. Nothing. For a few moments, I stood there, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to convince myself that whatever had been following me had lost interest. Maybe it had just been an animal after all, curious but ultimately harmless. But as I stood there, something else caught my eye. There, in the dirt just off the trail, was a footprint. A huge, unmistakable footprint. And not just any footprint, this one was humanoid, but it was far larger than any human print I'd ever seen, easily twice the size of my own boot. The toes were long and splayed, like something that had adapted to the forest floor. My stomach dropped. I crouched down, shining the flashlight on the print, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. Maybe I was seeing things, or maybe there was some logical explanation. Some weird optical illusion or trick of the light. But the longer I stared at it, the less I could deny what was right in front of me. I stood up, my pulse still racing, and turned back to the trail. I needed to get out of here, now. I started walking again, faster this time, my eyes darting between the trees, every shadow now a potential threat. My ears strained for any sound, but the forest remained unnervingly quiet. Too quiet. Then, just as I was starting to think I might make it back without incident, I heard it again, the footsteps. But this time, they were faster, closer, and gaining on me. I broke into a run, my legs burning as I tore down the trail. The heavy footfalls behind me matched my pace, each one thudding against the ground like a drumbeat. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. All I could do was run, my breath ragged, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my eyes focused on the path ahead. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to stop, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. I didn't know what was behind me, but I knew I couldn't let it catch me. Just when I thought my lungs would give out, I saw the trailhead up ahead, a break in the trees that led back to the main road. A surge of hope shot through me, and I pushed myself harder, the footsteps behind me growing louder, closer. I burst through the trees, stumbling onto the gravel road. The moment I hit the open space, the footsteps stopped. I spun around, gasping for breath, my flashlight swinging wildly through the trees behind me. But there was nothing there, no movement, no sound. I stood there, bent over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My entire body trembled, adrenaline still coursing through me. I half expected something to leap out from the shadows, but the forest was once again still, too still. I didn't stay to find out what had been following me. I didn't care anymore. I turned and walked quickly back to my car, not stopping until I was inside with the doors locked. As I sat there, trying to process what had just happened, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing, just the dark, quiet forest, and the knowledge that something had been out there with me, something that I had barely escaped. I haven't been back to that trail since. Story 5. The floorboards creaked overhead, each slow, deliberate step sending shivers down my spine. My hiking partner, Mike's, and I exchanged terrified glances in the dim light of our flashlights. We'd checked every inch of this abandoned cabin when we stumbled upon it, desperate for shelter from the raging storm outside. It had been empty then, so who or what was walking around upstairs now? It had started as a simple weekend hike, a chance for two old college buddies to reconnect and escape the grind of our 9-to-5 lives. Mike and I had been planning this trip for months, poring over trail maps and comparing gear lists with the excitement of kids preparing for summer camp. We set out early Saturday morning, the crisp mountain air filling our lungs as we hit the trail. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect hiking conditions. For the first few hours, it lived up to that promise. We trekked through sun-dappled forests, scrambled over moss-covered boulders, and paused to admire breathtaking vistas of the surrounding peaks. But as the day wore on, we noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. At first, we weren't too concerned. A little rain never hurt anyone, right? We had rain gear in our packs, and our tent was waterproof. We pressed on, determined to reach the campsite we'd picked out on the map. The storm hit with a ferocity that took us both by surprise. One minute we were hiking along a ridge, the next we were being buffeted by gale-force winds and pelted with rain so heavy it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Thunder boomed overhead, and flashes of lightning illuminated the suddenly menacing landscape around us. "We need to find shelter," Mike shouted over the howling wind. "This is too dangerous." I nodded, squinting through the rain. Our planned campsite was still miles away, and setting up a tent in this weather would be nearly impossible. We needed something more substantial. That's when I spotted it, a dark shape among the trees, too angular to be natural. "Look!" I yelled, pointing. "I think it's a cabin." We stumbled towards it, fighting against the wind every step of the way. As we got closer, I could make out weathered wooden walls and a sagging roof. It wasn't much, but it was our best hope for waiting out the storm. The door creaked ominously as we pushed it open, revealing a musty interior that spoke of years of abandonment. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs festooned the corners. But it was dry, and the walls seemed sturdy enough to withstand the tempest outside. "We should check it out," Mike said, pulling out his flashlight. "Make sure it's safe." We did a thorough sweep of the cabin. It was small, just 2 rooms downstairs and what looked like an attic or loft space above. There was no electricity, no running water, and the furniture that remained was in various states of decay. But it was empty of any current inhabitants, human or animal. "Looks like we lucked out," I said, dropping my backpack with a sigh of relief. "Let's get dried off and wait for this storm to pass." We changed into dry clothes and set up our sleeping bags on the least dusty part of the floor. The storm showed no signs of abating, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through every crack and crevice. We broke out our trail mix and some jerky, making a meager dinner as we listened to the fury of nature outside. As night fell, the cabin grew darker, the beam of our flashlights creating eerie shadows on the walls. We swapped stories to pass the time, reminiscing about our college days and catching up on each other's lives. But as the hours wore on, fatigue began to set in. "Maybe we should try to get some sleep," Mike suggested, stifling a yawn. "With any luck, the storm will be gone by morning." I agreed, and we settled into our sleeping bags. The cacophony of the storm made it hard to relax, but eventually exhaustion won out, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. I'm not sure how long I slept before the sound woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a branch scraping against the roof, but as I lay there, fully awake now, I realized it was something else entirely. Footsteps, coming from directly above us. I sat up, my heart racing. Mike was already awake, his eyes wide in the beam of the flashlight he'd hastily turned on. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, not trusting my voice. We both stared at the ceiling, listening intently. For a moment, all was quiet, except for the ongoing storm outside. Then, unmistakably, another step. "It's probably just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Mike. "Do a raccoon or something that got in through the roof?" Mike shook his head. "Those steps are too heavy for a raccoon. And we checked the whole place, remember? There was no way up to the attic." He was right. We'd looked for access to the upper level, but found nothing. No stairs, no ladder, not even a hatch in the ceiling. Whatever was up there now, it hadn't come in while we were sleeping. Another step, then another. It sounded like whatever it was pacing back and forth directly above our heads. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. "We need to get out of here," Mike said, already stuffing his sleeping bag into his pack. I hesitated. The storm was still raging outside. Leaving now, in the dark, with no idea where we were, could be suicide. But the alternative, staying here with some unknown entity, seemed equally dangerous. Before I could reply, a new sound froze us both in place. A long, low groan emanated from above, too deep to be the wind, too purposeful to be the settling of old timbers. It was a sound of pain, or hunger, or both. Mike and I stared at each other, terror evident in both our faces. This was no animal. Whatever was up there was something else entirely. "The door," I whispered, gesturing towards our only exit. "We'll make a run for it on 3. Mike nodded, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. We hastily grabbed our packs, not bothering to pack everything up. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking. 1, I mouthed silently. The footsteps above had stopped. 2, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. A tremendous crash from above cut me off. The entire cabin shook, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. Something had fallen or jumped with incredible force. We didn't wait for 3. I yanked the door open and we burst out into the storm. Rain lashed at our faces as we sprinted away from the cabin, not daring to look back. We crashed through underbrush, slipped on rain-slicked rocks, but kept running, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. I don't know how long we ran before we finally collapsed, gasping for breath. We were soaked to the bone, scratched and bruised from our headlong flight through the forest, but we were alive and far away from that hellish cabin. As we huddled under a large pine tree, waiting for the first light of dawn, we tried to make sense of what had happened. What had been in that attic? How had it gotten there? And what would have happened if we'd stayed? We never got answers to those questions. When daylight finally came, we made our way back to civilization, grateful to be alive and swearing off solo hiking trips for the foreseeable future. To this day, I sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of those footsteps echoing in my dreams. Mike and I have talked about going back, about trying to find that cabin again in the light of day. But something always comes up. Some excuse not to face whatever was waiting for us in that forgotten corner of the wilderness. Maybe it's better that way. Some mysteries, I've come to believe, are better left unsolved. But I'll never forget that night, the storm that drove us to shelter and the terror that drove us back out into it. It was a stark reminder that even in our modern world, there are still dark corners where the unexplained lurks, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble upon its domain. Story 6. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind you expect in the middle of the forest with the soft rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. No, this silence was different. It felt heavy, almost oppressive, like the woods were holding their breath. I sat up slowly in my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the grogginess that comes from a restless night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across our campsite. The others were still asleep, Dan, Sarah, and Mike, tucked in their tents just a few feet away from where I had set up my own. I glanced at my watch. 6:30 a.m. The first light of dawn should have been breaking through the trees, but the sky was still a dull, greyish hue, as if the sun wasn't quite ready to rise. We'd hiked out here the day before, deep into the wilderness for a weekend of camping and a break from our usual lives. The plan was simple: find a spot far enough away from any trails, set up camp, and spend a few days unplugged from the world, just us, the trees, and the fresh air. The kind of weekend that's supposed to leave you feeling refreshed. But now, sitting there in the eerie stillness, I didn't feel refreshed. I felt unsettled. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something was watching. I stood up, stretching my stiff muscles, and wandered over to the remnants of the fire to poke at the ashes. The wind should have been picking up by now, but there wasn't even the faintest breeze. No birds, no squirrels, not even the usual rustling in the underbrush, just that oppressive, dead silence. I looked around the campsite. Everything seemed in order. Tents still zipped up, our bags lined up near the fire. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in my gut. Something wasn't right. That's when I noticed it. Our gear, backpacks, cooking supplies, food, had all been dragged several feet away from where we'd left them. I stared at the bags, frowning. I knew for a fact we had packed everything up neatly the night before. We weren't careless campers, and I always made sure to secure the food, especially with the possibility of bears in the area. I walked over to the bags and knelt down. The dirt around them had been disturbed, like something heavy had been moving through the campsite. There were long, sweeping marks in the ground, almost like something had dragged our stuff, but no clear footprints. "Dan!" I called quietly, turning toward his tent. "You awake?" No response. I hesitated for a second, then unzipped his tent and peeked inside. He was still asleep, completely unaware that anything was wrong. Sarah and Mike were the same, fast asleep, as if the night had been as uneventful as it should have been. My stomach twisted, a nervous knot forming in my chest. I walked back to where our gear had been scattered and crouched down again, running my hand over the ground. The marks weren't from any animal I could recognize, and I had enough experience in the wilderness to know what bear, deer, and other animal tracks looked like. This was different. It felt deliberate. I stood up, glancing around the campsite again. The woods were thick around us, the trees standing tall and close together. It was the kind of place that felt isolated, even in broad daylight. The shadows between the trees were deep, making it hard to see too far beyond our little clearing. Suddenly, I felt exposed, like we were sitting ducks in the middle of something's territory. "Hey, get up!" I called out again, louder this time. Dan groaned and unzipped his tent, sticking his head out with bleary eyes. "What time is it?" "Something's messed with our stuff," I said, not bothering to answer his question. That woke him up. He scrambled out of the tent, Sarah and Mike following suit as I explained what I'd found. They all looked at the disturbed ground, the scattered gear, the eerie silence around us, and I could see the same unease creeping into their expressions. "You think it was a bear?" Mike asked, though he didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. "No tracks, no sign of anything like that." Sarah crossed her arms, looking around nervously. "So, what then? Some other campers screwing with us?" I didn't answer. Something about that didn't sit right with me either. We were miles away from any main trails, and we hadn't seen a soul on the way out here. This wasn't a well-known camping spot, and we had chosen it for that very reason. The odds of someone else stumbling upon our site in the middle of the night, moving our things without waking us up, and then disappearing without a trace. Unlikely. "Let's pack up and head back," Dan said, his voice tense. "We can find another spot or just cut the trip short." I nodded, relieved that someone else was on the same page. Whatever had happened last night, I didn't want to stick around to find out more. We moved quickly, packing up the tents and stuffing our scattered gear back into our bags. The sense of urgency was palpable, like we all wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as possible. As we worked, that heavy silence persisted. No birds, no wind, no life, just the quiet, suffocating stillness that had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't until we were almost ready to go that Sarah pointed it out. "Guys, look." She was standing near the edge of the clearing, her face pale, staring down at the ground. We all walked over, and I felt the breath leave my lungs. There, in the dirt, were massive drag marks. They cut across the clearing, disappearing into the dense woods beyond, and next to them, just barely visible in the soft earth, were footprints, huge, unmistakable footprints. But they weren't human. The prints were long, with deep impressions in the dirt, each one easily twice the size of my own foot, and there was something wrong about them. They were too wide, too irregular, like whatever had made them wasn't walking on just two legs, but was shifting its weight in a way that no animal should. "What the hell is that?" Mike muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Nobody answered. We just stood there, staring at the tracks, our brains struggling to make sense of what we were seeing. I felt my skin crawl. That same overwhelming sense of dread tightening around my chest. "We need to go," I said, my voice harsher than I'd intended. "Now!" No one argued. We finished packing in silence, all of us moving as quickly as we could, throwing our gear into our bags without the usual care. My hands were shaking as I tightened the straps on my pack, and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something to emerge from the trees at any moment. Once we were ready, we set off, hiking back the way we'd come. The trail that had seemed so familiar the day before now felt menacing, the trees pressing in on either side as we moved through the dense forest. My ears were on high alert, listening for any sound, any hint that we weren't alone. But the silence persisted, unnatural and suffocating. We hiked for what felt like hours, our pace brisk, almost panicked. Every few minutes, one of us would glance behind, checking for movement, for anything following us. The footprints had rattled all of us, and no one wanted to talk about it. It wasn't until we were about halfway back to the trailhead that the sounds of the forest began to return. The rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, the wind picking up through the trees. It should have been a relief, but instead it felt mocking, like whatever had been watching us had finally let us go. When we reached the trailhead, none of us said a word. We just climbed into the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. The drive back was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what had happened. I haven't been back to that forest since. None of us have. We don't talk about it either. It's like an unspoken agreement. We all know something happened out there, something we can't explain, but none of us wants to confront it. The woods, once my refuge, now felt like a place I was no longer welcome. Whatever had dragged our gear in the middle of the night, whatever had left those massive footprints, it wasn't something I ever wanted to meet again. And part of me knew, deep down, that if we hadn't left when we did, we might not have made it out at all. Story 7. The moment I saw those eyes staring back at me from my camera screen, I knew I'd captured something extraordinary and terrifying. What I didn't realize was that it had been watching me all along. My name is Alex Reeves, and I've been a wildlife photographer for the better part of 2 decades. I've trekked through jungles, scaled mountains, and waded through swamps to get the perfect shot. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, capturing images of the local wildlife for a conservation magazine. I'd spent weeks planning, studying the area's ecosystems and mapping out the best locations for my shots. The magazine wanted something special, something that would grab readers' attention and highlight the importance of preserving these wild spaces. I set up my base camp in a clearing near the edge of a vast, old-growth forest. The trees here were ancient giants, their gnarled trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick it seemed to blot out the sky. As I unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I chalked it up to the usual unease of being alone in the wilderness and focused on preparing for the night ahead. My plan was to use a photography blind, a camouflaged shelter that would allow me to observe and photograph animals without disturbing them. I'd set it up on a sturdy platform about 15 feet off the ground, giving me a perfect vantage point over a small clearing where I'd noticed a lot of animal activity. As dusk fell, I climbed up to my perch and settled in for a long night. The forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, the distant howl of a wolf pack. I adjusted my camera, making sure everything was set for low-light conditions. Hours passed, and I managed to get some decent shots. A family of raccoons foraging, a majestic elk pausing to drink from a stream, even a fleeting glimpse of a cougar slinking through the shadows. But I was still waiting for that one extraordinary image, the kind that could make a career. It was well past midnight when I first noticed something odd. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt that same sensation of being watched, more intense than ever. I peered into the darkness, straining my eyes for any sign of movement. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it, a shadow darker than the surrounding night, massive and unnaturally still. My heart pounding, I raised my camera. Whatever this was, it could be the shot I'd been waiting for. I adjusted the focus, my finger hovering over the shutter button, and then it moved. The creature stepped into a patch of moonlight, and I had to stifle a gasp. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur. Its body was powerfully built, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. But it was the face that truly chilled me, a strange mix of ape-like features and something almost human, with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. I started snapping photos frantically, my camera's shutter sound unnaturally loud in the silent forest. The creature's head swiveled towards me, those eyes locking onto my position with unnerving accuracy. It knew exactly where I was. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, my finger still automatically pressing the shutter button. Then, with a speed that belied its size, the creature turned and vanished into the forest, leaving nothing but swaying branches in its wake. I sat there, shaking for the rest of the night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I scrambled down from my blind and raced back to my campsite. I packed up in record time, my hands fumbling with zippers and straps as I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that hulking form emerging from the trees. It wasn't until I was safely back in my hotel room, hours later, that I dared to look at the photos I'd taken. Most were blurry, the result of my shaking hands and the low light, but a few were crystal clear. And in each of those intelligent, almost human eyes were staring directly into the camera, directly at me. The images were remarkable, unlike anything I'd ever captured or seen before. This wasn't a bear, wasn't any known species. It was something else entirely. My mind raced with the implications. Could this be the legendary Bigfoot, some unknown primate species, or something else, something beyond our current understanding? I spent the next few days holed up in my hotel room, poring over the images, enhancing them, analyzing every detail. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that I had stumbled upon something truly extraordinary. But with that realization came a creeping dread. Those eyes haunted me, the way they had locked onto me, the intelligence behind them. It was clear that this creature was aware of me long before I saw it. How long had it been watching? And why had it chosen to reveal itself? I debated what to do with the photos. Part of me wanted to share them with the world, to prove that there were still mysteries out there waiting to be discovered. But another part, a more primal part, warned me of the dangers. What if people came flooding into the forest, searching for the creature? What if it was captured, studied, destroyed? And more selfishly, what if it came looking for the one who had exposed its existence? In the end, I decided to keep the best images to myself, at least for now. I sent a few of the blurrier shots to the magazine, along with some of the more conventional wildlife photos I'd taken. The editors were thrilled, praising the moody, mysterious quality of the blurry images. They had no idea of the true nature of what they were seeing. As for me, I couldn't shake the experience. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, startling at shadows in the corner of my eye. I took fewer assignments in dense forests, preferring the open spaces of plains and deserts. But I couldn't stay away entirely. The pull of the unknown was too strong. I returned to those woods several times over the next few years, always alone, always watching and waiting. I never saw the creature again, but I felt its presence. Sometimes I'd wake in the night to find my campsite disturbed, large footprints in the soft earth around my tent. Once, I found a stack of stones piled in a way that was too deliberate to be natural, too complex to be the work of a conventional animal. These experiences changed me, changed how I saw the world and my place in it. I realized that for all our technology, all our scientific knowledge, there were still things out there beyond our understanding. The woods were deeper, the shadows darker, the mysteries greater than I had ever imagined. I still take photos, still capture the beauty and wonder of the natural world. But now, with every click of the shutter, I'm acutely aware that I might not be the only one watching. That out there, in the wild places of the world, there are eyes watching back. Intelligent eyes, knowing eyes. And sometimes, when I'm editing my photos late at night, I swear I can see those eyes again, peering out from the shadows of an image. A reminder that the greatest mysteries are often those that remain unseen, lurking just beyond the edge of the frame, waiting for their moment to step into the light. Story 8. I was sitting by the edge of the lake, the fishing line lazily drifting in the water, my mind wandering between the gentle ripples and the quiet beauty of the wilderness. This was exactly what I had needed, a solo trip, far from the chaos of the city, where I could just sit and think. It had been a stressful few months at work, and I needed this peace. There's something about being completely alone in nature, with nothing but the sounds of water lapping against the shore and the occasional call of a bird, that resets your mind. But on that particular day, the peace wasn't comforting. It was too quiet. The first thing I noticed was the wind. It had stopped completely. Not a single breeze to stir the surface of the lake or rustle the leaves of the trees behind me. The air felt still, thick even, and I found myself shifting uneasily in my seat. I scanned the tree line, eyes sweeping over the dense forest that surrounded the lake. It was a remote spot. No official campsites, no other people for miles as far as I knew. That's why I'd picked it. But something about the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have, the way the trees stood unnaturally still, was making my skin crawl. Then came the noise. It started faintly, almost like the sound of a branch snapping in the distance, but heavier, more deliberate. I straightened in my chair, my hand instinctively going to the handle of the small knife I carried on my belt. My eyes darted toward the far side of the lake, where the sound had come from, but there was nothing there, just the still water and the silent trees. I stood up, the fishing rod forgotten, and walked a few steps toward the edge of the water, squinting into the woods. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting long shadows over the landscape, making everything look distorted, unfamiliar. Another sound, this time louder, closer. It wasn't the crack of a small branch underfoot. It was more like something heavy had shifted, like a large tree had groaned and bent under pressure. My heart rate picked up, the uneasy feeling now a knot tightening in my chest. I wasn't alone out here, but whatever was moving in those woods, it didn't sound like a deer or a bear. It sounded bigger. I hesitated, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a dead tree falling, or a large animal moving through the brush, though the idea of a bear crossing this isolated area didn't sit well with me. But there was something in the air that told me this was different. Then, just as suddenly as the sounds had started, they stopped. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the tree line, waiting for more. But there was nothing, just that thick, suffocating silence again. I forced myself to breathe, trying to shake off the sense of dread creeping up my spine. I was overreacting. This was nature. Strange sounds happened. The woods were full of mysteries, and most of them were harmless. Still, I wasn't about to sit back down and continue fishing like nothing had happened. The growing sense of discomfort had ruined any chance of relaxing now. I needed to move. Maybe check around the area, just to be sure nothing or no one was lurking nearby. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag, even though there was still plenty of daylight left. It was more of a comfort thing, having something to illuminate the dense underbrush if I needed it. I started to walk the perimeter of the lake, keeping my eyes on the trees, my ears alert for any sign of movement. As I got closer to the area where the sounds had come from, I slowed down. The ground here was soft, the kind of soil that left deep impressions if anything large had passed through. I knelt down, running my hand over the earth, and that's when I saw them. Tracks, huge, heavy impressions pressed deep into the dirt. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They weren't the prints of any animal I knew of. They were too long, too wide, and shaped in a way that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I stared at them for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. The tracks looked almost like giant footprints, bipedal, but they were far too big to belong to any human. Each step was spaced out like whatever had made them had a massive stride, and they led directly into the woods, toward the area where I'd heard the sounds. My pulse quickened as I slowly stood up, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Something had been here, something large, and it was moving in my direction. I backed up slowly, eyes darting between the tracks and the trees ahead of me. The sense of being watched was overwhelming now. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get back to the safety of the shoreline, maybe even to pack up and head out before nightfall. But I hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. What the hell had made those tracks? My rational brain kept trying to come up with an explanation, but nothing seemed to fit. A bear. No, bears don't leave tracks like that. Maybe someone had been out here messing around, but how? There were no other campsites, no nearby trails. No one should have been out here but me. The wind picked up suddenly, making the trees creak and sway, and I flinched at the sound. It felt like the forest itself was coming alive, like the trees were whispering warnings I couldn't understand. Then from deep within the woods came the breathing, slow, heavy, rhythmic. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It was close now. Whatever was making that sound was just beyond the tree line, hidden in the dense undergrowth, watching me. I could hear its deep, guttural exhale, the sound of something massive taking in air. I slowly backed away, careful not to make any sudden movements. My heart was hammering in my chest, my hands shaking as I gripped the flashlight tightly. The breathing continued, low and steady, as if the thing was just waiting, deciding what to do next. I turned and walked back toward the lake, keeping my pace as calm as I could manage, though every fiber of my being wanted to run. I reached the shoreline, glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees. But there was nothing. The forest remained still, quiet again. I reached my gear, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. Now, whatever was in those woods, I didn't want to stick around to find out more. I grabbed my pack and started shoving everything inside as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I fumbled with the straps. And then, just as I was about to sling the pack over my shoulder, I heard it again, the breathing. But this time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the water. I turned slowly, my blood turning to ice as I stared out at the lake. The surface, once calm and still, had begun to ripple as if something large was moving beneath it. And there, just beneath the surface, I saw it, a massive shadow, slowly gliding through the water toward the shore. My breath caught in my throat. It was huge, whatever it was, its dark form moving with terrifying grace beneath the water. The ripples grew larger as it came closer, and I could see the outline of its body now, long and sinewy, with something that looked disturbingly like limbs propelling it forward. I backed up, stumbling over the rocks as I tried to put distance between myself and the lake. The thing beneath the surface slowed as it neared the shore, its shadow looming just beneath the shallow water. For a moment, everything was still. The wind stopped. The trees stopped swaying, and the air grew deathly quiet. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, the shadow moved, surging toward the shore. I didn't wait to see what came next. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the rocky ground as I sprinted away from the lake, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the sound of water crashing against the shore behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My lungs burning and my legs trembling. I threw my pack into the back seat and slammed the door shut, my heart still pounding in my chest. My hands shook as I started the engine, the sound of the car coming to life, a welcome relief against the suffocating silence of the forest. As I sped down the narrow dirt road, leaving the lake and the woods behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. something ancient, something that had been waiting in the depths, unseen, until I had stumbled into its territory, and I knew, without a doubt, that I would never return to that lake again. Story 9. The sound of branches snapping jerked me back to consciousness. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I strained to peer through the rain-streaked windshield. The car sat dead silent on the lonely forest road, and something large was moving in the darkness, just beyond my headlights. I hadn't planned on driving through the night, but a last-minute work emergency had forced me to hit the road much later than I'd intended. My name's Sarah, and I'm a wildlife biologist. I was headed to a remote research station deep in the mountains, where my team was studying the impact of climate change on local ecosystems. The drive had started off uneventfully enough. The winding forest road was familiar to me after years of making this trip. But as night fell and the rain started, the journey became more treacherous. The downpour reduced visibility to almost nothing, and I found myself leaning forward, squinting to make out the road ahead. I was about 2 hours from my destination when it happened. A massive shape suddenly materialized in my headlights, crossing the road with surprising speed for its size. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing on the wet asphalt. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I was going to spin out into the ditch. But then the tires found purchase, and I skidded to a stop. My heart was pounding as I sat there, hands shaking on the wheel. What was that? A bear? An elk? Whatever it was, it had been big, much bigger than any animal I was used to seeing in these parts. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. That's when I realized the car had stalled. I turned the key in the ignition, but nothing happened, not even a click. The headlights were still on, illuminating the rain-soaked road ahead, but the engine was completely dead. Come on, I muttered, trying the ignition again and again. Still nothing. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, with no cell service and something very large lurking in the forest around me. I weighed my options. The research station was still a good 30 miles away, much too far to walk, especially in this weather and with whatever was out there. The nearest town in the other direction was even further. My best bet was to stay with the car and hope that another vehicle would come along soon, unlikely as that seemed on this rarely traveled road. That's when I heard it, the sound of branches snapping, coming from the woods to my right. My head snapped around, peering into the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. For a moment, all I could see was the curtain of rain and the shadowy outlines of trees. Then something moved. It was just a flicker of motion at first, barely distinguishable from the swaying of branches in the wind. But then I saw it more clearly, a large, dark shape weaving between the trees, drawing closer to the road, to my car. My breath caught in my throat. Despite years of studying wildlife, despite countless encounters with bears and mountain lions and other predators, I had never felt fear like this before. There was something fundamentally wrong about the way this creature moved, something that defied my understanding of animal behavior. I reached for my phone, forgetting for a moment that I had no service. My hand brushed against something else in the center console, my flashlight. I grabbed it, the weight of it reassuring in my hand. The shape in the woods had stopped moving. It was just standing there now, barely visible in the gloom. Was it watching me? I raised the flashlight with a trembling hand, my thumb on the switch. Part of me didn't want to illuminate whatever was out there, didn't want to confirm the impossible thoughts racing through my mind, but I had to know. I clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the rain, landing on a massive, fur-covered form. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, standing upright on 2 legs, but it was all wrong. The proportions were off, arms too long, shoulders too broad, head sitting low between hunched shoulders. And its eyes, God, its eyes, they reflected the light like an animal's, but there was an intelligence there that chilled me to my core. It was looking right at me, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was aware in a way that went beyond animal instinct. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My scientific mind was screaming that this was impossible, that there was no such creature in any taxonomy. But my instincts, the primitive part of my brain that recognizes predators, was overwhelmed with a sense of danger. Then it moved. A massive, hair-covered arm reached out, grabbing the trunk of a nearby tree. The wood creaked under its grip. Was it just my imagination, or did I hear the sound of bark splintering? That broke the spell. I dropped the flashlight and lunged for the door lock, my fingers scrabbling at the button. I had to get out of here, had to run. But where? The rational part of my mind knew I couldn't outrun this thing, whatever it was. The car was my only protection, flimsy as it might be. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. But when I shone it back to where the creature had been standing, there was nothing there, just empty woods and falling rain. My eyes darted around wildly, searching the darkness. Where had it gone? The silence stretched on, broken only by the patter of rain on the roof and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Minutes passed. Maybe it was gone. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, some kind of stress-induced hallucination. I almost convinced myself of that when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound coming from somewhere behind the car. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I turned to look out the rear window. At first I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved, and suddenly it was there, its massive form filling my rearview mirror. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that I didn't even recognize as my own voice. My hand flew to the ignition, turning the key desperately. To my shock and relief, the engine roared to life. I didn't stop to question this sudden turn of fortune. I just slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator. The tires spun on the wet road for a heart-stopping moment before finding traction. The car leapt forward, and I saw the creature's form recede in my rearview mirror. I kept my foot pressed firmly on the gas, taking the winding road's curves much faster than was safe, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I drove like that for, I don't know how long, my eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of pursuit. Eventually, the adrenaline began to wear off, and I felt the crash coming. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I realized I was gasping for breath. I forced myself to slow down, to breathe deeply. What had I just experienced? My scientific training warred with what my eyes had seen. There was no known animal that matched what I had encountered. The closest thing I could think of were the legends of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but I'd always dismissed those as myths, campfire stories. As the first light of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky, I finally reached the research station. My colleagues were alarmed by my state, and I found myself struggling to explain what had happened. How could I describe something that defied explanation? In the end, I told them a simplified version of events, that I had nearly hit a large animal on the road and had been spooked. It wasn't the whole truth, but how could I expect them to believe the reality of what I had seen? In the days and weeks that followed, I threw myself into my work, trying to distract myself from the memory of that night, but I couldn't shake it entirely. Every time I ventured into the woods, I found myself scanning the trees, jumping at shadows. The forest, that had once been my sanctuary, now felt alien and threatening. I never saw the creature again, never found any concrete evidence of its existence. But I know what I saw that night on that lonely forest road. It changed me, changed how I view the world and our place in it. There are things out there beyond our understanding, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our scientific knowledge. And sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls through the trees, I find myself wondering, is it still out there, watching and waiting, and what would happen if our paths were to cross again? Story 10. There's something about the woods at dusk that makes everything feel strange, like the world is slipping into some other dimension. The light starts to fade, the shadows stretch longer than they should, and the air gets colder. That's when it started, the feeling that we weren't alone out there. I was hiking with my buddy Josh, the two of us trying to squeeze in one last adventure before winter hit. We'd chosen this trail because it was remote, and we wouldn't have to deal with the usual crowds of hikers. We liked it that way, just us, the mountains, and miles of untouched wilderness. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the valley in a dull, fading orange glow, something felt off. It was Josh who noticed it first. We were walking along the ridge, trying to find a good spot to set up camp for the night, when he suddenly stopped and grabbed my arm. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice low, almost shaky. I followed his gaze, squinting into the distance. There, on the opposite side of the valley, I saw what had caught his attention, a dark figure standing on the edge of the tree line, just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and completely still. At first, I thought it was a tree, maybe a weirdly shaped one, or a boulder casting a shadow in the fading light. But then it moved, just a small shift, like it was turning slightly, watching us. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Yeah, I see it." Josh was already pulling out his binoculars, adjusting the focus as he brought them to his eyes. I stood there, tense, waiting for him to say something, but he was silent for a long time, just staring. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep the nervous edge out of my voice. He lowered the binoculars slowly, his face pale. "I don't know, man. It's not a person, or at least, it doesn't look like one." I snatched the binoculars from him and raised them to my own eyes, focusing on the figure. He was right. It wasn't a person. The thing was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, unnaturally thin limbs. It was too far away to see any details, but there was something wrong about the way it stood, something that made my stomach churn. I lowered the binoculars, my heart pounding. "Let's keep moving." We didn't say much after that. Both of us were on edge, glancing over our shoulders every few minutes, but the figure didn't follow us, or at least, not that we could see. The trail was narrow, winding along the ridge, and we kept our pace brisk, eager to put distance between us and whatever we had seen. By the time we found a small clearing to set up camp, the sun had almost disappeared completely, leaving the forest bathed in deep shadows. We worked quickly, setting up the tents and gathering firewood, the unease from earlier still hanging over us like a cloud. As night fell, we sat by the fire, its orange glow casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. The woods were quieter than usual, no sounds of wildlife, no wind rustling the leaves, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig beneath our boots. Josh poked at the flames with a stick, his face set in a frown. "I can't stop thinking about that thing we saw," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, staring into the fire. "Me either. It wasn't human, was it?" He shook his head. "No, no way. And it wasn't a bear or anything else I've ever seen." We sat in silence for a while, the unease growing with every passing minute. My mind kept replaying the moment we'd seen the figure, how still it had been, how unnaturally tall. And that feeling, the one that had settled over me the moment I laid eyes on it, was still there. That deep, instinctual knowledge that we weren't supposed to be here, that something was watching. Eventually, we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and lay there in the darkness, listening to the crackle of the dying fire and the occasional rustle of Josh shifting in his sleeping bag. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that my mind was just playing tricks on me, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure again, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, but eventually, exhaustion must have overtaken me, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly, my body jolting awake with a cold, gnawing sense of dread. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow across the campsite, and everything was deathly silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence you'd expect in the wilderness, but a thick, oppressive quiet that pressed in from all sides. And then I heard it, a low, deep grunt, almost like a growl, coming from just beyond the edge of the campsite. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was close, too close. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the snuffling of a bear or the rustle of a deer moving through the brush. It was something else, something I couldn't place. Another grunt, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving through the underbrush. I sat up slowly, my hands shaking as I reached for the flashlight beside me. I didn't want to turn it on, didn't want to draw attention to myself, but the darkness was too thick, too terrifying to face without light. My heart hammered in my chest as I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the clearing, and my stomach dropped. There, standing just beyond the glow of the embers, was the figure, the same one we'd seen earlier. But now, up close, I could see it more clearly, and it was worse than I'd imagined. It was taller than any human should be, easily over 8 feet, now that I could judge its size properly. Its limbs were long and unnaturally thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. But the worst part was its face, if you could even call it that. Hollow eyes, black and empty, stared back at me, and its mouth hung open, revealing jagged, yellow teeth. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen in place, staring at this thing as it stared back at me. Then it moved, slowly. It stepped forward, its long, bony legs carrying it toward the edge of the firelight. Each step was slow and deliberate, like it was in no hurry, like it knew I wasn't going anywhere. Its head tilted slightly, its hollow eyes fixed on mine, and I felt a wave of pure, unbridled terror wash over me. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding in my ears as I fumbled for my knife. I didn't know what good it would do against something like this, but it was all I had. The thing stopped just at the edge of the firelight, its grotesque face still fixed on me, as if it was deciding what to do next. My mind screamed at me to run, to get up and bolt into the woods, but I knew that would be suicide. I couldn't outrun something like this. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the trees, and the creature snapped its head to the side, its hollow eyes narrowing. Another crash, and then the sound of something large moving through the forest. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my pack, unzipped the tent, and bolted. I didn't even look back to see if Josh was awake. I just ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could through the darkness, branches whipping at my face as I tore through the underbrush. The sound of the creature's footsteps faded behind me, replaced by the blood rushing in my ears and the pounding of my heart. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, my chest heaving as I gasped for breath, my body trembling with adrenaline. Only then did I turn back, expecting to see that thing stalking after me. But the road was empty, silent. The woods, dark and still. I never went back to that place. And I never asked Josh what happened after I left. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something that should exist, not here, not anywhere, and I wasn't about to risk seeing it again. Story 11. The stench hit me first, a nauseating mix of decay and something else, something primal and unfamiliar. As I stared at the mutilated carcass of the deer, my instincts screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity, that damned curiosity that had always pushed me to seek out the unknown, urged me forward. I had no idea that following that blood trail would lead me to question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My name's Jack, and I've been a hunter for most of my 45 years. I know these woods like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out, rifle slung over my shoulder, the familiar weight a comfort as I trekked through the underbrush. The season had just opened, and I was eager to bag my first deer of the year. I'd been out for a couple of hours, following game trails and checking my usual spots, when I came across the first signs that something was off. Broken branches, gouged bark on trees, signs of something big moving through the forest. At first, I thought it might be a bear, though the markings seemed too high up for even the largest black bear I'd ever encountered. Then I found the deer, or what was left of it. The carcass was torn apart in a way I'd never seen before. This wasn't the work of wolves or mountain lions. The deer had been ripped open, its internal organs scattered around as if whatever had killed it had been searching for something specific. But it was the precision of some of the cuts that truly unsettled me. They were too clean, too deliberate for any animal I knew of. I knelt down to examine the carcass more closely, my hand instinctively going to the hunting knife at my belt. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were partially obscured by the blood and entrails, but what I could see made no sense. They looked almost human, but much larger, with strange indentations at the toes that could only be claw marks. My heart was pounding now, a mix of fear and excitement coursing through me. In all my years in these woods, I'd never seen anything like this. I knew I should probably alert the game wardens, let the professionals handle whatever was going on here, but that curiosity of mine was in full force now. I had to know what had done this. I stood up, wiping my hands on my pants, and looked around. There, leading away from the grisly scene, was a trail of blood droplets. Whatever had killed the deer had dragged part of it away. Without really thinking it through, I started to follow the trail. The blood led me deeper into the forest, into areas I rarely ventured. The trees grew closer together here, old-growth giants that blocked out much of the sunlight. The underbrush was thick, and I had to move slowly, carefully, to avoid making too much noise. Every snapping twig under my boots sounded like a gunshot in the eerie silence of the woods. I'm not sure how long I followed the trail. Time seemed to lose meaning in the dim, green-tinged light filtering through the canopy, but eventually I noticed the ground starting to slope upward. The blood trail was getting fresher, the droplets larger and more frequent. Whatever I was tracking, I was getting close. Then I saw it, a dark opening in the side of a rocky outcropping, a cave. The blood trail led straight to it. I stood there for a long moment, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Every instinct I had developed over decades of hunting was telling me to turn back, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I'd come too far to turn back now. I had to know. Slowly, I unslung my rifle, checking to make sure a round was chambered. I clicked on the small flashlight I kept in my pocket and, taking a deep breath, stepped into the cave. The smell hit me like a physical force, that same stench of decay I'd encountered at the deer carcass, but stronger now, mixed with a musky odor that reminded me of wet dog, only much, much worse. I fought the urge to gag, breathing shallowly through my mouth as I moved deeper into the cave. My flashlight beam seemed pitifully small in the encompassing darkness. The cave was larger than I'd expected, the ceiling rising away beyond the reach of my light. I swept the beam around, trying to take in my surroundings. That's when I saw them, the bones. They were everywhere, scattered across the cave floor and piled in corners. Most seemed to be from deer and other large animals, but some looked disturbingly human. I felt my gorge rise and had to take a moment to compose myself. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to notice other things. Strange markings on the walls, not random scratches, but deliberate patterns that almost looked like some kind of writing. And in one corner, partially hidden behind a pile of bones, I saw what looked like crude tools, stones that had been chipped and shaped into rough blades. My mind was reeling. What was this place? What kind of creature was I dealing with? It clearly wasn't any animal I was familiar with. The tools, the markings, they suggested an intelligence that went beyond mere animal cunning. I was so lost in my thoughts that I almost missed the sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very walls of the cave. I whirled around, my rifle raised, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the rocky surfaces, and then I saw it. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, its massive frame filling the cave entrance. Covered in thick, matted fur, with arms that hung almost to the ground, ending in hands tipped with vicious-looking claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me, a bizarre mix of ape-like features and something almost human, with eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My finger tightened on the trigger of my rifle, but I knew, somehow, that it would be useless against this creature. Then it moved, faster than anything that size had any right to move. I caught a glimpse of those terrifying claws coming towards me, and then everything went black. I woke up outside the cave, the afternoon sun warm on my face. My head was pounding, and when I reached up to touch it, my hand came away sticky with blood. My rifle was gone, and my jacket was torn to shreds. I staggered to my feet, disoriented and confused. Had I dreamed the whole thing? But no, my injuries were real, and my rifle was missing. Whatever I had encountered in that cave, it had been real, and for some reason it had let me live. I made my way back to my truck in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had happened. I knew I should report it, tell someone what I had seen, but who would believe me? And more importantly, did I want to expose whatever was living in those woods to the outside world? In the end, I kept quiet. I told my wife I'd had a fall, explained away my missing rifle as carelessness, but I never went back to that part of the woods again. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself staring out the window towards the distant tree line, and I wonder, is it still out there? Are there more of them? I've been a hunter all my life, but that day in the cave, I realized that there are some things that were never meant to be hunted, some mysteries that should remain unsolved. The woods are deeper and darker than we know, and there are creatures out there that defy our understanding of the natural world. Now, when I hear stories around the campfire about strange sightings in the woods, about unexplained noises in the night, I stay quiet, but I listen. And I wonder how many others have glimpsed the truth that lurks in the shadows of our world, forever changing how they see the wilderness around them. Story 12. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. Our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into a blackness so complete it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing through the abandoned mineshaft. Something was in here with us, something that had no right to exist in this long-forgotten underground labyrinth. My name is Mike, and I've always been drawn to the forgotten places of the world. Urban exploration, they call it. The art of investigating abandoned buildings, forgotten tunnels, and derelict industrial sites. It's a hobby that's gotten me into trouble more than once, but nothing could have prepared me for what my best friend Jacus and I encountered in that old silver mine. We'd heard rumors about the mine for years. Locals spoke in hushed tones about strange noises coming from the sealed entrance, about animals that went missing if they strayed too close. Most dismissed it as superstition, the kind of stories that spring up around any abandoned place. But Jake and I, we saw it as a challenge. It took weeks of planning and preparation. We studied old maps, gathered specialized equipment, and waited for the perfect weekend when the forest rangers would be occupied with a controlled burn on the other side of the mountain. Finally, on a crisp autumn morning, we set out. The mine entrance was hidden behind a tangle of overgrown vegetation, the old warning signs barely visible beneath a layer of rust and lichen. It took us the better part of an hour to clear away enough of the growth to access the boarded-up opening. With a mix of excitement and trepidation, we pried away the rotting planks and peered into the yawning darkness beyond. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying with it the musty smell of decay and something else, something I couldn't quite place. Jake and I exchanged grins, our headlamps illuminating our excited faces. This was what we lived for, the thrill of the unknown, the chance to step back in time and explore a place untouched by human hands for decades. We entered cautiously, our powerful flashlights cutting through the gloom. The main shaft stretched out before us, railway tracks still visible beneath a layer of debris. The walls were lined with old support beams, some worryingly rotted. We moved slowly, carefully, documenting everything with our cameras. As we ventured deeper into the mine, the air grew thicker, heavier. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional drip of water from unseen crevices. We passed old mining equipment, rusted carts, and tools left behind as if their owners had simply vanished mid-shift. It was when we reached a junction, about a half-mile into the mountain, that things started to get weird. Our compass, which had been working fine up until that point, began to spin wildly. The temperature dropped noticeably, our breath coming out in visible puffs. "Mike, check this out," Jake called, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. He was crouched near the wall, examining something. As I approached, I saw what had caught his attention: claw marks, deep gouges in the solid rock. What the hell could have made these? I wondered aloud, running my fingers over the marks. They were huge, far larger than any bear or mountain lion I'd ever encountered. Jake shook his head, his expression a mix of excitement and unease. "I don't know, man, but whatever it was big. We should have turned back then." In hindsight, every instinct was screaming at us to get out. But we were too caught up in the mystery, too eager to uncover the secrets of this forgotten place. We pressed on, following the tunnel that bore the claw marks. The air grew colder still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. More than once, I thought I saw movement in the shadows just beyond the reach of our lights, but when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. It was about an hour later, deep in the heart of the mountain, that our flashlights began to falter. At first, it was just a slight dimming, barely noticeable. But then Jake's light flickered and went out entirely. Mine followed suit moments later, leaving us in complete darkness. Panic set in immediately. We fumbled for our backup lights, our hands shaking. I could hear Jake's ragged breathing next to me, could feel the fear radiating off him in waves. "It's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We've got spares, we'll be fine." But as I reached for my backup flashlight, a sound froze me in place. A low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the tunnel. Jake let out a strangled whimper. "Mike," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What was that?" Before I could answer, I felt something brush against my leg, something large and furry. I jerked away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. In my panic, I dropped my backup light. I heard it clatter to the ground, rolling away into the darkness. The growl came again, closer this time, and then I felt hot breath on the back of my neck. What happened next is a blur in my memory. I remember screaming, remember grabbing Jake's arm and running blindly through the darkness. We stumbled and fell countless times, scraping ourselves on rough stone walls and tripping over unseen obstacles. All the while we could hear it behind us, heavy footfalls, the scrape of claws on stone, that terrifying growl growing ever closer. I don't know how long we ran or how we managed to find our way back through the twisting tunnels. By some miracle, we emerged into the fading daylight, bursting out of the mine entrance and collapsing onto the forest floor. We lay there for what felt like hours, gasping for breath, too terrified to move. When we finally gathered the courage to look back at the mine entrance, we saw nothing but darkness. No sign of pursuit, no indication of the terror we'd just escaped. In the days and weeks that followed, Jake and I tried to make sense of what had happened. We pored over our photos and videos, but found nothing conclusive, just shadows and blurry shapes that could have been anything. We debated whether to tell anyone about our experience, but who would believe us? In the end, we decided to keep it to ourselves. But the memory of that day haunts me still. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that growl echoing in the darkness of my room. I've given up urban exploration, no longer able to find joy in the abandoned places of the world, because now I know that sometimes those places aren't as abandoned as we think. And sometimes, in the deepest, darkest corners of the earth, there are things that lurk just beyond the reach of our flashlights. Things that defy explanation, that challenge everything we think we know about the world around us. I don't know what was in that mine. I don't want to know. But I do know this. There are mysteries in this world that are better left unsolved, secrets that should remain hidden in the darkness. Because once you've glimpsed what lies beyond the veil of the ordinary world, you can never truly go back. The darkness is always there, waiting, and with it, the memory of that terrifying growl in the depths of the earth. Story 13. It was supposed to be just another quiet night on patrol. Nothing unusual, just the hum of my old truck's engine, the soft crunch of gravel under the tires, and the endless stretch of forest on either side of the narrow dirt road. As a park ranger, I'd driven this route more times than I could count. The woods had become a second home to me, and I knew every bend in the road, every tree that lined the path. The darkness didn't bother me. It never had, until that night. I first noticed it when my headlights caught something up ahead, a flash of movement so quick and subtle that I almost convinced myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But I knew these woods too well to brush it off entirely. I slowed the truck down, peering through the windshield into the dense undergrowth lining the road. Nothing. Just the familiar silhouettes of trees standing tall and still, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. I was about to press the gas again when something darted across the road. It was so fast, I barely had time to register what I'd seen. A blur of dark fur, long limbs, and a sense of size that didn't match anything I'd ever encountered out here. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed on the brakes, the truck jerking to a stop in the middle of the road. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring into the darkness, trying to catch my breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. What the hell was that? I muttered to myself, more out of disbelief than an actual question. I turned off the engine, the sudden silence pressing in around me, making the stillness of the night feel even more suffocating. Grabbing my flashlight from the dashboard, I hesitated for a second before opening the door. The air outside was cool and damp, carrying with it the earthy smell of pine and soil. I stepped out, my boots crunching softly on the gravel as I shone the light around the road. The beam of the flashlight sliced through the dark, revealing only the empty stretch of road and the thick wall of trees beyond. But I knew I'd seen something. I wasn't imagining it. The way it had moved, it wasn't a deer or a bear or any other animal I'd encountered in these woods. It was too quick, too fluid. I crossed the road, my flashlight sweeping through the trees where the thing had disappeared. That's when I saw them. Tracks. They were large, unnaturally large, and bipedal. The kind of tracks that made my skin prickle and my stomach churn. They sank deep into the damp earth, each step spaced out like whatever made them had an impossibly long stride. I crouched down, shining the light closer, trying to make sense of the shape. The prints were almost human, almost. But there was something wrong about them. The toes were too long, the heels too wide, and the depth of the impression suggested a weight that far exceeded any person. I stood up, my heart pounding a little faster now. The woods, usually so familiar and comforting, suddenly felt different. I wasn't alone out here. A branch snapped somewhere deeper in the forest, the sharp crack echoing through the trees. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, my pulse quickening. My instincts screamed at me to get back in the truck, to drive away and leave whatever was out here to its own devices. But curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, kept me rooted to the spot. Another snap, closer this time. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe evenly. "Okay," I muttered under my breath. "You're just hearing things. It's probably just a deer or—" The thought died in my throat as something stepped out from the tree line. It was tall, taller than I'd expected, easily 7 or 8 feet, and covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear. It couldn't be. The way it moved, the way it stood, hunched over but unmistakably bipedal, was all wrong for any animal I knew. The flashlight beam wavered in my trembling hand as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Its eyes caught the light, reflecting back a dull, unsettling glow, and its face, its face, was a grotesque mix of animalistic and humanoid features, with a long snout and wide, dark eyes that seemed to bore into me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both frozen in the quiet night. My breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, my mind struggling to process the impossibility of the creature standing in front of me. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. Then slowly it tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. Its eyes narrowed, and I felt a cold dread wash over me, a primal fear that I hadn't felt since I was a child. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just some animal. It was intelligent. It knew I was there, and it was assessing me. Without warning, it let out a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the air like a distant thunderclap. The sound vibrated in my chest, sending a jolt of fear straight through me. My legs finally responded, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight as I scrambled to get back to the truck. The creature didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me, watching my every step. I reached the truck, fumbling with the door handle, my hands shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to pull it open. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it out of pure instinct. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I didn't dare look back toward the woods, afraid of what I might see. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition, the truck sputtering to life with a comforting roar. I threw it into gear and hit the gas, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the road, leaving the creature and whatever it was planning far behind. For several miles, I didn't slow down, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road blurred beneath me, and my mind raced just as fast, replaying the encounter over and over again. What had I seen? Some kind of wild animal, a mutated bear. No, it had looked too human, too deliberate. It wasn't until I reached the ranger station that I finally let myself breathe again. I pulled into the parking lot, killed the engine, and sat there in the darkness, my body shaking from the adrenaline that still coursed through me. I had to tell someone, I had to report it, but what the hell was I going to say? I saw something in the woods, and it looked like a cross between a man and an animal. They'd laughed me out of the job, or worse, think I'd lost it. And maybe I had. Maybe the long hours in the wilderness, the isolation, had finally gotten to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I knew what I'd seen. I climbed out of the truck and made my way inside the station, my legs still shaky beneath me. I sat down at my desk, staring blankly at the radio, debating whether to call it in. The words stuck in my throat. How could I explain this? How could I put into words something that shouldn't exist? I never did report it. Instead, I sat there, staring at the darkness beyond the window, waiting for the first light of dawn to break the uneasy stillness that had settled over the forest. The following days were uneventful, quiet even, but every time I patrolled that stretch of road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. The tracks had vanished by the next morning, washed away by a light rain, leaving no evidence of what I'd seen. But I knew it was still out there, whatever it was. Story 14. The howl that pierced the night air was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was too deep for a wolf, too haunting for a coyote, and far too close for comfort. As our group huddled together in the darkness, the beam of my flashlight caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at us. Eyes that were far too high off the ground to belong to any normal predator. My name is Emily, and I've been a wilderness guide for the better part of a decade. I've led hundreds of tours through the backcountry, from day hikes to week-long expeditions. I thought I'd seen it all, but that night in the Cascade Mountains changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. It was supposed to be a routine night hike, a chance for tourists to experience the forest after dark. There were 6 of us in total. Myself, my assistant guide Mark, and 4 guests, a middle-aged couple named Tom and Linda, their teenage son Jack, and a solo traveler named Sarah. We set out just after sunset, the last rays of light painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Owls hooted in the distance, small mammals rustled in the underbrush, and the wind whispered through the trees. It was magical, the kind of experience that reminded me why I loved my job so much. I led the group along a well-worn trail, pointing out interesting plants and signs of animal activity as we went. Our flashlights carved paths through the darkness, illuminating the wonder on my guests' faces. Even Jack, who had spent most of the day complaining about being dragged on this lame nature trip, seemed engaged, his eyes wide as he took in the transformed nighttime landscape. We were about an hour into the hike when I first sensed something was off. The forest had gone unusually quiet. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. I've learned over the years to trust my instincts, and right now, every fiber of my being was screaming that something wasn't right. I signaled to Mark to bring up the rear of the group, keeping everyone close together. "Let's take a quick break," I announced, trying to keep my voice casual. "Everyone stay close and keep your voices down. Sometimes we can hear larger animals moving through the forest at night." As the group huddled together, whispering excitedly about what we might hear, I scanned our surroundings. The darkness beyond our little pool of light seemed oppressive, almost alive. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, searching for any sign of movement. That's when we heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It started deep and guttural, rising to a pitch that sent shivers down my spine. I'd heard wolves and coyotes countless times, but this was different. There was an almost human quality to it, a level of complexity that defied explanation. "What was that?" Linda whispered, clutching her husband's arm. "Probably just a wolf," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. They can sound pretty eerie at night, but I knew it wasn't a wolf. Whatever had made that sound was something else entirely. As if to confirm my fears, another howl answered the first, this one much closer, then another and another. We were surrounded. "I think we should head back," Mark said quietly, moving closer to me. I could see the concern in his eyes, mirroring my own growing unease. I nodded, turning to address the group. "All right, folks, we're going to cut the hike short tonight. Everyone stay close together. Mark will lead, and I'll bring up the rear. Keep your flashlights on and pointed at the trail." We set off back the way we had come, moving at a brisk pace. The silence in the forest was broken only by our footsteps and the occasional nervous whisper from one of the guests. I kept my flashlight sweeping from side to side, watching for any sign of movement in the undergrowth. We had been walking for maybe 10 minutes when Jack suddenly stopped, pointing off to our right. "Did you see that?" he hissed. "Something big just moved over there." I swung my flashlight in the direction he was pointing. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something large ducking behind a tree, something that seemed to be moving on 2 legs. My heart rate doubled. "Keep moving," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Don't stop. Don't look around. Just focus on the trail ahead." But it was too late. The others had seen my reaction, had heard the fear in my voice. Panic was setting in. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice high with fear. "What's out there?" Before I could answer, another howl split the night, so close it felt like it was right on top of us. Linda screamed, and suddenly our orderly line dissolved into chaos. Tom grabbed his wife and son, pulling them into a run. Sarah was right behind them, with Mark shouting for everyone to stay together. I brought up the rear, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I ran. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls came from all around us. Whatever was out there, there were several of them, and they were fast. my light caught something moving parallel to us, just beyond the trees. It was big, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, running on 2 legs with a loping, inhuman gait. I caught a glimpse of matted fur, of long arms swinging with each stride. Then I saw the eyes, reflective, like an animal's, but set high off the ground. And in that brief moment of illumination, I saw intelligence in those eyes. This was no ordinary predator. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning as I struggled to keep up with the group. We burst out of the tree line into the parking area where we had started the hike, everyone gasping for breath and looking around wildly. "Get in the van!" I shouted, fumbling for the keys. "Hurry!" We piled in, and I gunned the engine, tires squealing as we peeled out onto the main road. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of multiple large, shadowy figures at the edge of the forest before we rounded a bend and they disappeared from view. The drive back to town was silent, everyone too shocked to speak. It wasn't until we were safely back at the lodge that the questions started. What were those things? Why hadn't I warned them about the dangers? Was this some kind of sick joke? I did my best to calm everyone down, to explain that in all my years as a guide, I'd never encountered anything like this before. I offered refunds, apologies, anything to placate them. But I could see in their eyes that this experience had shaken them to their core. It had shaken me too. In the days that followed, I gave a statement to the Forest Service. They sent out teams to investigate, but of course, they found nothing conclusive. Just some unusually large tracks that they attributed to bears, and broken branches that could have been caused by any large animal. I knew what I had seen, what we had all seen, but I also knew that no one would believe the truth. So I kept quiet, filed my report about an unusually aggressive pack of wolves, and tried to put the incident behind me. But I couldn't forget. Those eyes haunted my dreams. That howl echoed in my mind during quiet moments. I found myself researching cryptids, poring over local legends about Sasquatch and other mysterious creatures of the Pacific Northwest. I still work as a guide, still lead groups into the wilderness. But now I'm more cautious, more aware of the shadows between the trees. I no longer dismiss the stories told around campfires about strange creatures in the woods. Because I know that out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that for all our technology and knowledge, nature still holds mysteries that we may never fully understand. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is hidden and the forest holds its breath, I swear I can hear that howl again, calling from the darkness. A reminder that the wilderness is vast and ancient, and that we are merely guests in a world that holds secrets beyond our comprehension. Story 15. The first scream came just as the sun disappeared behind the mountain ridge, turning the sky a deep shade of purple. It was distant, faint at first, but unmistakably human. It cut through the evening air like a knife, jolting me out of the peaceful trance I'd settled into after a long day of hiking. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, straining my ears to listen for anything else. Nothing, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the creak of trees shifting in the growing darkness, and the soft crackle of the campfire behind me. I glanced over at Will and Ben, my 2 hiking partners, but they hadn't noticed. They were sitting by the fire, chatting and laughing, completely unaware. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, standing up and taking a few steps toward them. "Hear what?" Will replied, looking up at me with a raised eyebrow. "That scream," I said, my voice quieter now, as if speaking it out loud would somehow make it more real. "Sounded like someone's out there?" Ben shook his head, tossing another log onto the fire. "It's probably an animal. You know how the mountains can mess with sound, especially at dusk, echoes and stuff." But I wasn't convinced. There was something about that scream, something that made my skin prickle. I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know what animals sounded like, and this wasn't that. This had been distinctly human, sharp, panicked. I sat back down, my ears still tuned to the forest around us. The fire crackled and popped, the warmth pushing back the chill of the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest felt too quiet now, like it was holding its breath. The second scream came less than 10 minutes later, louder this time, closer. This time, Will and Ben both shot to their feet, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" Ben said, his voice tight, all the humor from earlier gone. "I told you," I said, my heart now pounding in my chest. "It's a scream. Someone's out there." Will grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the tree line, the beam cutting through the growing darkness. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows long and twisted in the dim light, but nothing moved. There was no sign of anyone, no sign of anything. "Maybe someone's hurt," Will said after a moment, the unease clear in his voice. "We should go check it out." I hesitated. The thought of heading into the woods in the dark, following the sound of screams, didn't sit well with me. But at the same time, if someone was hurt or in trouble, we couldn't just ignore it. That wasn't who we were. Reluctantly, I grabbed my own flashlight and nodded. "Yeah, let's check it out." But we stay together. The three of us set off into the woods, the firelight quickly fading behind us as we moved deeper into the trees. The night had fully taken over now, and the forest around us was draped in shadows, the kind that seemed to move just out of the corner of your eye. My flashlight beam bounced off tree trunks and underbrush, illuminating patches of ground, but never enough to make me feel comfortable. The silence was oppressive, thick, like the forest itself was watching us. I kept expecting to hear another scream, but the air remained still, eerily so. My heart pounded in my ears, every snap of a twig beneath my boots sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. We walked for what felt like hours, but it was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. The further we went, the more I started to feel it, that strange sensation you get when you know you're being watched. My skin prickled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, convinced that something, or someone, was following us. "You guys feel that?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," I muttered, "like we're not alone." Will, who had been leading the way, stopped suddenly. "Look!" He pointed his flashlight to the ground, and my stomach dropped. There, in the soft dirt, were footprints. Massive, human-like footprints, but too large, too wide to belong to any normal person. They sank deep into the ground like whoever or whatever had made them was incredibly heavy. And there was something else, long, claw-like marks beside the prints, as if whatever it was had been dragging something along with it. "What the hell is this?" Will muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. "Those are too big to be a person's," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. The tracks led deeper into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. The direction they were heading lined up perfectly with where we had heard the screams. This is crazy," I said, taking a step back. "We need to get back to camp." "This isn't right." Will stood up, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "We can't just leave someone out here, can we? What if they're hurt?" I shook my head, my gut churning with dread. "I don't know, man. What if whatever made these tracks, what if it's not human? We're not equipped to deal with that." Ben looked at me, eyes wide with fear. "You're saying we should leave. I'm saying we need to be smart about this. We don't know what's out there." But before we could make any decision, the forest erupted with a sound so loud, so guttural, that it made the ground beneath us tremble. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a roar, a deep, bone-rattling sound that came from somewhere far too close for comfort. My heart leaped into my throat, and without thinking, I turned and started running. I didn't care if it was cowardly. Whatever had made that noise wasn't human, and I had no intention of sticking around to find out what it was. I heard Will and Ben right behind me, their footsteps pounding the earth as we tore through the forest, branches whipping at our faces and catching on our clothes. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to get back to camp, back to the safety of the fire, back to anything that wasn't this dark, twisted nightmare. The roar came again, closer this time, and I could hear the heavy thud of something massive crashing through the trees behind us. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Whatever it was gaining on us. We broke through the tree line, the flickering light of the campfire suddenly in view, and I pushed myself harder, my legs burning with the effort. I stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath, and spun around just as Will and Ben burst out of the woods behind me. For a moment, there was silence again, just the crackle of the fire and the sound of our ragged breathing. My chest heaved, every muscle in my body trembling from the fear and adrenaline coursing through me. But then the trees at the edge of the clearing shifted. Something big, something dark, moved just beyond the firelight. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the movement, and my blood ran cold. There, standing just at the edge of the forest, was a figure, tall, massive, its body covered in matted fur, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It stood on two legs, hunched over, its breath coming in low, deep grunts that sent shivers down my spine. For a second it just watched us, its eyes reflecting the flickering firelight like two burning coals, and then, slowly, it stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness without a sound. The three of us stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where it had been. None of us spoke, none of us moved. It was like we were all waiting for it to come back, for it to charge out of the trees and finish what it had started. But it didn't. The forest remained still, as if nothing had ever been there. Finally, Will broke the silence. "We're leaving. Now." None of us argued. We packed up our gear in record time, our hands shaking, our eyes constantly scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Within minutes, we were on the trail, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we hurried down the mountain, leaving the campfire burning behind us. We didn't speak the entire way back to the car. We didn't have to. We all knew what we had seen, and we all knew we'd never come back. Story 16. I was nearly 60 feet up in the fire watchtower when I first saw it. At that height, you can see everything. The vast stretch of trees, the winding dirt roads, the lakes glistening in the sun, and sometimes even a bear wandering through the underbrush. The air is clean. The forest feels alive, and the quiet is usually comforting. Usually, but that day, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a strange energy in the air, a heaviness that made my skin crawl. It was the kind of feeling that settles in your gut and doesn't leave, no matter how much you try to shake it. And that was before I saw the shadow. The sun was starting to set, casting the forest in a wash of gold and purple. I had just finished my usual evening sweep with the binoculars when something caught my eye, a dark figure moving quickly through the trees below. At first, I thought it was a bear, but it moved differently. It was fast, almost impossibly fast, and it was on two legs. My heart skipped a beat, and I raised the binoculars again, focusing on the patch of forest where I'd seen it. Nothing. I scanned the area again, slower this time, methodically sweeping through the trees, but whatever it was, it had vanished. The forest floor was still, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and everything looked normal, too normal. I lowered the binoculars and leaned against the railing, staring down at the thick stretch of forest below me. The fire watchtower was isolated, miles away from any real civilization, with only a narrow dirt road connecting it to the ranger station. The kind of place where you could go days without seeing another human being. I usually loved it for that reason. The solitude, the quiet, the peace. But right then, as the shadows grew longer and the light started to fade, the solitude felt more like a trap. I forced myself to calm down, to think rationally. It could have been an animal, a deer maybe, even though it had looked way too big for that. Or it could have been my eyes playing tricks on me, distorting the shadows as the light dimmed. I took a deep breath and told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light. But then I heard the noise. A low, guttural sound drifted up from the forest floor. It was faint, almost too faint to hear over the wind, but it was there, like a growl, but deeper, more resonant. My heart started to race as I scanned the trees again, every muscle in my body tense. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't a bear or a wolf or any other animal I'd ever heard in the forest. It was something else, something bigger. I grabbed my radio from the small table inside the tower and flicked it on. "Ranger Post, this is Tower 3. Do you copy?" Static crackled through the speaker, followed by a faint, garbled voice. "Tower 3, this is Ranger Post. Go ahead." "I think there's something out here," I said, my voice low, as if speaking too loudly might draw whatever it was closer. "I saw something in the trees, and I'm hearing noises. Something's not right." There was a long pause, and then the ranger's voice crackled back through the speaker. "Probably just a bear. Tower 3, the woods can get weird around dusk. Stay put and keep an eye on things. Let us know if it gets closer." I didn't respond. I just stared out into the forest, my grip tightening on the radio. I didn't need to be told to stay put. I wasn't going anywhere. The growling sound came again, louder this time, and closer. I flicked the spotlight on, aiming it toward the area where the sound was coming from. The bright beam of light cut through the growing darkness, illuminating the dense underbrush and casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. For a few moments, nothing happened. The forest was still, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. And then I saw it. The figure stepped out from behind a tree, just at the edge of the spotlight's beam. It was tall, taller than any human should be, and covered in dark, matted fur. But it wasn't just the size that made my blood run cold. It was the way it moved, with a deliberate, almost predatory grace. Its long arms hung down at its sides, and its head was tilted slightly, as if it was listening. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The thing stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring up at the tower. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. The growl came again, low and menacing, and the figure took a step forward, moving closer to the base of the tower. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What the hell was I supposed to do? The tower was high enough that it couldn't reach me. At least, I hoped it couldn't. But the thought of being trapped up here all night with that thing lurking below was enough to make me panic. I grabbed the radio again, my hand shaking. "Ranger Post, this is Tower 3. I need backup. Now, there's something down here. Something big." There was more static, followed by the same garbled voice. "Copy that. Tower 3. Hold tight. We're sending someone out." I didn't wait for a response. I dropped the radio on the table and backed away from the railing, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure below. It was closer now, moving with that same slow, deliberate pace, like it had all the time in the world. It circled the base of the tower, disappearing into the shadows before reappearing on the other side, always staying just at the edge of the spotlight's reach. For a moment, I thought it was going to leave, to melt back into the forest and disappear as quickly as it had come. But then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged at the tower. The entire structure shook as it slammed into one of the support beams, the sound of metal groaning and wood splintering filling the air. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance as the tower swayed dangerously. My heart raced, panic surging through me as I realized what it was doing. It was trying to knock the tower down. I grabbed the spotlight and aimed it directly at the creature, hoping the bright light would scare it off. But it didn't even flinch. It slammed into the tower again, harder this time, and I heard one of the support beams crack under the force. I had to do something. If it kept this up, the whole tower would collapse, and I'd be trapped up here with nowhere to go. I scanned the small room, my eyes landing on the flare gun mounted on the wall. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I grabbed the flare gun, loaded it with shaky hands, and ran back to the railing. The creature was still there, circling the base of the tower, growling low and deep as it prepared to charge again. I took a deep breath, aimed the flare gun, and fired. The flare shot through the air with a bright, fiery arc, landing just a few feet from the creature. For a split second, everything was bathed in red light, and I got my first real look at it. It was massive, easily over 8 feet tall, with long, sinewy limbs and a twisted, almost human-like face. Its eyes glowed in the light of the flare, 2 pinpoints of malevolent red, and its mouth was twisted into a snarl, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. But it was the eyes that sent a wave of pure terror through me. They were intelligent, calculating. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound so loud and primal that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and bolted into the forest, disappearing into the trees with a speed that didn't seem possible for something so large. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the flare still burning brightly in the distance. My hands shook so badly I had to drop the flare gun. The tower creaked and groaned in the wind, but it held. It was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even sit down. I spent the rest of the night pacing the small platform, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement, my ears straining for any sound that might indicate it was coming back. The backup ranger didn't arrive until dawn, and when he finally pulled up in his truck, I could barely speak. I just pointed to the base of the tower, where the cracked support beam and the deep, claw-like gouges in the wood told the story I couldn't. He looked at me, his face pale, and simply nodded. I never went back to that tower. I quit the job the next day. Story 17. I've spent 15 years as a forest ranger, and I thought I'd seen it all. But that night in the Cascade Mountains changed everything I believed about the wilderness and what lives in its shadows. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where your breath hangs in the air and the scent of pine needles fills your lungs. I was on my usual night patrol, flashlight in hand, ears attuned to the familiar sounds of the forest. The beam of light swept across the undergrowth, catching the occasional glint of animal eyes in the darkness. I'd just rounded a bend in the trail when I heard it, a scream that made my blood run cold. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever encountered either. It was a high-pitched, almost mournful sound that echoed through the trees and sent a shiver down my spine. My first instinct was to radio for backup, but curiosity got the better of me. I'd dealt with injured animals before, and I thought maybe this was just a case of a wounded creature in distress. How wrong I was. I moved off the main trail, following the direction of the sound. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. Every snap of a twig under my boots made me flinch. The screams had stopped, but now there was an eerie silence that felt even more oppressive. After about 10 minutes of careful progress, I came to a small clearing. My flashlight beam swept across the ground, and that's when I saw them. Footprints, but these weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe. My mind raced, trying to match them to any known animal in the region, but coming up blank. I knelt down to examine them closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp in the soft earth. Whatever made them had passed through here recently, very recently. As I stood up, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the night. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees. It was tall, far taller than a man, with a broad, muscular shape that defied explanation. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The forest had gone deathly quiet, not even the rustle of leaves in the wind. But I could feel it, a presence, watching me from the shadows. My skin prickled with the intensity of its gaze. Slowly, I began to back away, never taking my eyes off the spot where I'd seen the movement. My training told me to stay calm, to make no sudden movements. But every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. As I reached the edge of the clearing, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the darkness. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep, primal, and undeniably threatening. My nerve broke, and I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted down the trail, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear something moving in the forest parallel to me, keeping pace with ease. It was fast, impossibly fast for its size. I didn't stop running until I reached my vehicle, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock the door. As I slammed it shut behind me, I caught one last glimpse of a massive shape at the tree line, its eyes reflecting the glow of my headlights for just a moment before it melted back into the forest. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, but there was no explanation that fit. No known animal could account for those footprints, that speed, that size. When I reported the incident, my colleagues were skeptical. They suggested it might have been a bear, or maybe I'd just been spooked by shadows. But I knew what I'd seen, even if I couldn't explain it. In the days that followed, I returned to that clearing with a team. We found the footprints, took plaster casts, and combed the area for any other signs. But apart from some broken branches high up in the trees, far higher than any known animal in the region could reach, there was nothing conclusive. The official report chalked it up to an unidentified large mammal, but that didn't begin to capture the truth of what I'd encountered. I've spent countless nights since then out in those woods, hoping for another glimpse, another chance to prove what I know is out there. But whatever it was, it stayed hidden. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I think I can hear that scream again, far off in the distance, and I wonder if it's watching me, just as I'm searching for it. I've been a ranger for a long time, and I've always prided myself on knowing these forests like the back of my hand. But that night taught me a valuable lesson. There are some things in this world that defy explanation, some mysteries that lurk just beyond the reach of our understanding. I don't know what's out there in the deepest parts of the wilderness, but I do know this. I'm not the only one who's seen it. There are others, hikers and campers and fellow rangers, who've had their own encounters. Most keep quiet, afraid of ridicule or disbelief. But I've made it my mission to collect these stories, to piece together the puzzle of what's really living in our forests. Some nights, as I sit on my porch looking out at the tree line, I think about that massive shape I saw. I wonder if it's out there right now, moving silently through the darkness. And I can't help but feel a mix of fear and awe at the thought that there are still secrets out there, waiting to be discovered. This job has taught me to respect the wilderness, to never underestimate its power or its mysteries, but it's also shown me that there's so much we don't know, so much that science has yet to explain. And until we have answers, all we can do is keep our eyes open and our minds ready for the unexpected, because out there, in the depths of the forest, something is watching, something that doesn't fit into our neat categories of known wildlife, something that reminds us that we're not at the top of the food chain, not really. And as I sit here, writing this account of that night, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting, watching, a reminder that the world is a far stranger and more wonderful place than we ever imagined. So the next time you're out in the wilderness and you hear a sound you can't quite place, or see a shadow that seems just a little too large to be natural, remember my story. Remember that there are things in this world that defy explanation. And maybe, just maybe, you'll catch a glimpse of the unknown, like I did on that fateful night in the Cascade Mountains. Just be prepared. Once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. And you'll never look at the forest the same way again. Story 18. I used to love camping. The crisp air, the starry nights, the sense of connection with nature. But after what happened that night in the Adirondacks, I can't even look at a tent without breaking into a cold sweat. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. My best friend Jake and I had been planning this trip for months, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and recharge in the wilderness. We'd hiked deep into the backcountry, far from any marked trails or campgrounds. The isolation was exhilarating. At first, We set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to touch the sky. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, trading stories and laughing like we didn't have a care in the world. If only we'd known what was watching us from the darkness. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I first heard it, the sound of a branch snapping. Somewhere in the forest beyond our tent. I'm usually a heavy sleeper, but something about that noise cut through my dreams and jolted me awake. "Jake," I whispered, nudging my friend. "Oh, did you hear that?" He grunted, still half asleep. "Probably just a deer or something. Go back to sleep." I tried to follow his advice, but sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle of leaves, every whisper of wind through the trees, had me on edge. And then I heard it again. Another crack, closer this time, and another. Whatever was out there, it was big, and it was moving towards us. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Jake, wake up! There's something out there." This time, he heard it too. We lay there in silence, straining our ears. The footsteps, and I was certain now that they were footsteps, circled our campsite. Slow, deliberate, as if whatever it was sizing us up. "What do we do?" Jake whispered, his voice tight with fear. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced through our options. We were miles from the nearest road, our phones useless out here in the wilderness. Running blindly through the forest at night seemed like a recipe for disaster, but staying put, with only the thin fabric of our tent between us and whatever was out there, felt equally terrifying. Suddenly, a shadow fell across our tent, something massive, blocking out the moonlight. I could hear its breathing now, heavy and guttural. My whole body tensed, waiting for it to attack, to tear through the tent and drag us out. But it didn't. Instead, it moved away, towards our campsite. We heard the sound of things being knocked over, of fabric ripping. Our supplies, I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach. It was destroying our supplies. "We have to do something," Jake said, reaching for the flashlight we'd kept by our sleeping bags. I grabbed his arm. "Are you crazy? We don't know what that thing is." "Exactly," he hissed back. "We need to see what we're dealing with." Before I could stop him, he unzipped the tent flap and shone the flashlight out into the clearing. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of utter destruction. Our backpacks had been torn apart, their contents strewn across the ground. The remnants of our food hung from tree branches, as if whatever had done this was taunting us. And then the light fell on something that made my blood run cold. Footprints, but not like any animal prints I'd ever seen. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe, and they were unmistakably bipedal. Jake's hand shook, the flashlight beam dancing erratically across the clearing. "What the hell made those?" he whispered, as if in answer. A low growl emanated from the forest to our right. We whirled around, the light catching a pair of eyes reflecting back at us. They were set high off the ground, far higher than any normal animals would be, and they were intelligent, filled with a predatory cunning that sent shivers down my spine. For a moment, we were frozen, locked in a standoff with whatever was watching us from the shadows. Then it moved, so fast it was almost a blur. A massive, dark shape rushed towards us, and we did the only thing we could. We ran. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every step. I could hear it behind us, moving with an impossible speed for something so large. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me going. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually the sounds of pursuit faded, and we found ourselves on the edge of a small stream. We collapsed on the bank, gasping for air. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of our situation set in. We were lost in the wilderness, with no supplies, no idea which direction would lead us back to civilization, and something out there hunting us. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. I looked up at the sky, trying to orient myself using the stars, like my dad had taught me years ago. "We keep moving," I said. "We follow this stream. It has to lead somewhere." And so we walked, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment that thing would burst out of the forest and finish what it had started. The first rays of dawn were just starting to peek over the horizon when we heard the most beautiful sound imaginable. A car engine, somewhere in the distance. We stumbled onto a road about an hour later, probably looking like wild men to the startled family that stopped to help us. We spun a story about getting lost, not mentioning the creature or the destroyed campsite. Who would believe us anyway? In the days that followed, as we recovered from our ordeal, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We scoured the internet for any similar reports, any explanation for what we'd encountered. We found more questions than answers. Stories of other campers with similar experiences, blurry photos of large, unidentified creatures, conspiracy theories about government cover-ups. The official search party never found our campsite. It was as if it had vanished, swallowed up by the forest. The authorities chalked our story up to the overactive imaginations of two city boys out of their depth in the wilderness. But I know what I saw. Those footprints, those eyes gleaming in the darkness. They haunt my dreams. I've never gone camping again, and I doubt I ever will. The forest holds secrets, ancient and terrifying, and some things are better left undisturbed. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I think I can hear it, that low, rumbling growl that sends shivers down my spine. And I wonder if it's out there still, roaming the wild places of the world, waiting for unsuspecting campers to stumble into its territory. I've tried to put that night behind me, to chalk it up to an unexplainable, one-time encounter. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk just beyond the edge of our understanding. And once you've seen them, once you've felt their eyes upon you, you can never truly feel safe in the wilderness again. So, if you're planning a camping trip, my advice is this: stick to the marked trails, the populated campgrounds. Don't venture too deep into the unknown. Because out there in the darkest parts of the forest, something is waiting, something that doesn't take kindly to intruders in its domain. And if, in the dead of night, you hear branches breaking and heavy footsteps circling your tent, don't look. Don't try to be a hero, just run, and pray that you're faster than whatever's chasing you. As for me, I'll stick to the safety of the city, where the only monsters are the ones we create ourselves. The wilderness can keep its secrets. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 19. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the images I captured that day in the Alaskan wilderness left me speechless. As a wildlife photographer, I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing could have prepared me for what my camera revealed in those remote woods, or for the terror that followed. It was supposed to be a routine assignment. National Geographic had sent me to document the wildlife in a particularly isolated stretch of Alaskan forest. The area had been the subject of strange rumors and sightings for years, but I'd chalked that up to the overactive imaginations of isolated locals. I'd been in the business long enough to know that most mysterious creatures turned out to be nothing more than shadows and wishful thinking. How wrong I was. I'd been in the field for a week, capturing stunning shots of wolves, bears, and eagles, but it was on the 8th day that everything changed. I'd set up my blind near a small clearing, hoping to catch some of the area's more elusive residents. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I noticed movement at the edge of the trees. At first, I thought it was a bear. The shape was large and dark, moving with a lumbering gait. I raised my camera, heart racing with excitement. A good bear shot could make the whole trip worthwhile. But as I peered through the viewfinder, adjusting the focus, I realized this was no bear. The creature that emerged into the clearing defied explanation. It walked on 2 legs, but its proportions were all wrong for a human. It stood easily 8 feet tall, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, and its face. I still have trouble describing its face. It was almost human-like, but with a protruding snout and eyes that seemed to glow in the fading light. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. My finger hovered over the shutter button, trembling slightly. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this couldn't be real, that I must be seeing things. But the photographer in me knew that this could be the shot of a lifetime. I started snapping photos, the quiet click of the shutter sounding impossibly loud in the stillness of the forest. The creature's head snapped in my direction, those eerie eyes seeming to stare right through my camouflaged blind. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it had spotted me, but then it turned away, moving back towards the tree line with surprising grace for something so large. In seconds, it had vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a memory card full of impossible images. I waited until full dark before I dared to leave my blind, my hands shaking as I packed up my gear. The walk back to my campsite was the longest of my life. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me jumping, convinced that the creature was stalking me through the darkness. Once safely in my tent, I pulled out my laptop with trembling hands. I had to see the photos, to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. As the images loaded, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, in high-definition clarity. A creature that shouldn't exist, that couldn't exist, staring back at me from my screen. I spent hours poring over the photos, zooming in on every detail. The musculature visible beneath the fur, the intelligent gleam in its eyes, the way its hands, because they were undeniably hands, not paws, grasped at low-hanging branches. This was no man in a suit, no clever hoax. This was something entirely unknown to science. Sleep was impossible that night. My mind raced with the implications of what I'd seen. Should I contact National Geographic immediately, alert the local authorities, or would doing so only invite ridicule and disbelief? I'd heard stories of other photographers and researchers whose careers had been ruined by claims of cryptid sightings. As dawn broke, I made a decision. I needed more evidence. A few photos, no matter how clear, wouldn't be enough to convince the skeptics. I had to go back to try and capture video footage of the creature. I spent the day scouting locations, looking for signs of the creature's passage. As the sun began to set, I found myself back at the original clearing, my camera ready. Hours passed with no sign of activity. The forest was eerily quiet, as if all the normal wildlife was hiding from something. Just as I was about to call it a night, I heard it, heavy footsteps, branches breaking under significant weight. My heart began to race as I raised my camera, ready to capture the footage that would change everything. But as the creature emerged from the tree line, something was different. It moved with purpose, its head swiveling as if searching for something. Searching for me, I realized with a jolt of terror. Somehow it knew I was there. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The creature's nostrils flared, scenting the air, and then its eyes locked onto my hiding spot with chilling precision. A low growl rumbled through the clearing, a sound that vibrated in my chest and sent primal fear coursing through my veins. In that moment, I forgot about the footage, about my assignment, about everything except survival. I burst from my hiding spot and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth. Behind me, I could hear the creature giving chase, its powerful strides eating up the distance between us. I ran blindly through the darkening forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. The sound of pursuit grew closer, the creature's breathing heavy and guttural. Just as I felt sure it was about to overtake me, the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. I tumbled down a steep embankment, my world becoming a blur of pain and confusion. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, dazed and battered, I looked up to see the creature standing at the top of the slope. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I was certain this was the end, that it would bound down the hill and tear me apart, but instead It let out a long, mournful cry that echoed through the trees. Then, to my utter amazement, it turned and melted back into the forest. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, listening to the sounds of the creature moving away. When I finally gathered the courage to stand, I realized I'd lost my camera in the fall. My proof, my evidence gone. The hike back to my campsite was a blur of pain and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound a harbinger of the creature's return. I packed up my gear with shaking hands and started the long trek back to civilization, looking over my shoulder with every step. In the days and weeks that followed, I grappled with what to do. The photos I'd taken the first night were still on my laptop, tantalizing evidence of something extraordinary. But without the additional footage, without my lost camera, would anyone believe me? I spent countless hours researching, trying to find any reports of similar creatures in the area. I found more questions than answers, vague stories of giant, hair-covered beasts, blurry photos that could be anything. Nothing as clear, as definitive as what I'd seen. In the end, I decided to keep the photos to myself, at least for now. The memory of those glowing eyes, of the creature's raw power as it chased me through the forest, was enough to give me pause. What if by revealing its existence, I put it in danger? Or worse, what if I led others into those woods, only for them to meet a fate worse than mine? So I sit here writing this account, the photos safely encrypted on a hard drive. Sometimes, late at night, I pull them up, staring at the impossible creature I encountered, and I wonder, is it still out there, roaming those remote forests? Are there others like it? One thing I know for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are things out there, just beyond the edge of our understanding, that defy explanation. And sometimes, the greatest discoveries are the ones we choose to keep secret. As for me, I've hung up my wildlife photography gear. These days, I stick to landscapes and cityscapes, safer subjects with no risk of capturing something that might turn the hunter into the hunted. But on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I can almost hear that mournful cry again. And I wonder if, somewhere out in the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness, that creature remembers me too. Story 20. I've always loved the outdoors, but after what happened in the Appalachian wilderness, I can't shake the feeling that the forest doesn't love me back. What started as a routine hiking trip turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. Some say the woods hold secrets, but I never imagined they could hold terrors beyond our understanding. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance for me and 3 of my closest friends to escape the grind of city life and reconnect with nature. We'd chosen a lesser-known trail in the Appalachians, eager to avoid the crowds and really immerse ourselves in the wilderness. Little did we know, we'd soon be praying for the safety of crowds. The first day of our hike was picture perfect. The autumn air was crisp, the foliage a riot of reds and golds. We made good time, joking and catching up as we wound our way deeper into the mountains. By late afternoon, we realized we'd overshot our planned campsite. "No worries," said Mike, always the optimist of our group. "We'll just find a nice spot and set up camp here. We're already off the main trail, so it'll be more of an adventure." Sarah and Tom agreed enthusiastically, but something made me hesitate. The forest seemed different here, older somehow. The trees grew close together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the fading sunlight, but we were all tired, and the thought of backtracking wasn't appealing, so I pushed my unease aside. We found a small clearing and quickly set up camp. As night fell, we gathered around our campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, and more than once I caught myself starting at what I thought was movement just beyond the circle of light. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice hushed. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing but the crackle of our fire and the usual nighttime forest sounds, but then, faintly, I caught it, a sound like whispers on the wind, too distant to make out words but unmistakably there. "Probably just the wind in the trees," Tom said, but he didn't sound convinced. We tried to shake it off, to recapture the light-hearted mood of earlier, but an undercurrent of tension had crept in. We turned in early, zipping ourselves into our tents with a sense of relief. I woke in the middle of the night to an eerie silence. The normal sounds of the forest, insects, owls, the rustle of small animals, had all gone quiet, and in that silence I heard it again, the whispers, closer now, seeming to come from all around us. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Guys!" I hissed. "Wake up!" Mike stirred in his sleeping bag next to me. "What's wrong?" Before I could answer, a blood-curdling scream split the night. It was Sarah in the other tent. We scrambled out, flashlights in hand, to find her and Tom already outside, their faces pale with fear. "There's something out there," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I saw a shadow, something big. It was watching us." We stood there, backs to each other, scanning the darkness beyond our campsite. Our flashlight beams seemed pitiful against the pressing blackness of the forest, and all around us those whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Pack up, quickly. We'll hike back to the main trail." No one argued. We broke camp in record time, stuffing our gear haphazardly into our packs. As we worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping. We set off in what we hoped was the direction of the main trail, our flashlights casting bobbing circles of light ahead of us. The whispers followed, always just at the edge of comprehension. Occasionally, I thought I caught a word or phrase, but it slipped away before I could grasp it. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when Mike stopped suddenly. "And guys," he said, his voice tight with fear, "I think we're going in circles." I looked around, my stomach sinking. He was right. The clearing we'd just entered looked disturbingly familiar. Our abandoned campsite sat before us, the ashes of our fire still smouldering faintly. "That's impossible," Tom said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. "And we've been walking in a straight line." A twig snapped loudly in the darkness beyond the clearing. We all whirled toward the sound, flashlights raised. For a split second I thought I saw something, a tall, dark shape melting back into the shadows, but it was gone before I could be sure. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, no longer indistinct, but a cacophony of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The very air seemed to vibrate with their intensity. "Run!" I shouted. And we did. We crashed through the underbrush, all thought of finding the trail forgotten in our panic. Branches whipped at our faces, roots seemed to reach up to trip us. And always those whispers pursued us, growing louder, angrier. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmare forest. But suddenly I burst out of the trees onto a gravel road. The others tumbled out behind me, gasping for breath. The whispers cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. We stood there, panting, looking back at the wall of trees we'd emerged from. It looked like any other stretch of forest now, peaceful in the pre-dawn light. A car rounded the bend, its headlights momentarily blinding us. The driver, an early-morning fisherman, was startled to find 4 wild-eyed hikers on the road. He kindly gave us a ride to the nearest ranger station, where we spun a story about getting lost in the dark. We didn't talk about the whispers, or the shadows, or the way the forest had seemed to trap us. Who would believe us? But I saw the same haunted look in my friends, eyes that I knew was in mine. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We pored over maps, trying to understand how we could have become so disoriented. We researched the area's history, looking for any legends or stories that might explain what we'd experienced. We found more questions than answers, vague tales of hikers going missing over the years, of strange lights seen in those woods, of people emerging with stories of lost time. Nothing concrete, nothing that could fully explain the terror of that night. I've never gone back to those mountains. The others haven't either. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind blows just right, I think I can hear those whispers again, calling me back. In my dreams, I'm still running through those endless woods, pursued by something I can't see but can feel, watching my every move. I used to think I knew the forest, that I understood its rhythms and its ways. But that night taught me a harsh lesson. There are things in this world that defy explanation, forces that exist just beyond the edge of our understanding. The wilderness is not empty, and it's not always benign, so if you're planning a hiking trip, stick to the well-traveled paths. Don't venture off into the unknown, no matter how tempting the solitude might seem. Because out there in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest, something is waiting, something that whispers in forgotten languages and hunts in the shadows. And if you find yourself lost in the woods, with night falling and strange sounds all around, remember this. The forest is ancient, and it holds secrets older than humanity itself. Some trails are better left untraveled, some mysteries better left unsolved. As for me, I'll stick to city parks and well-lit nature preserves. The call of the wild isn't worth the price of answering it, because sometimes, when you venture into the heart of the wilderness, you find that it has a heart of its own, and it's not always a kind one. Story 21. I've been a hunter all my life, tracking deer through dense forests and stalking elk in open meadows. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the backwoods of northern Michigan. It was supposed to be a routine hunting trip, a chance to test out some new gear. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It all started with a malfunction in my trail camera. I'd set it up a week before the hunting season opened, hoping to get a sense of the deer patterns in the area. When I went to check it, I found the memory card full of corrupted files and glitchy images. Frustrated, I was about to pack it in when I noticed something strange in one of the salvageable photos. At first glance, it looked like a blur. Maybe a deer moving too fast for the camera to capture clearly, but as I zoomed in, my blood ran cold. The shape was all wrong for a deer. It was tall, bipedal, with long arms that nearly reached the ground. The image was grainy and distorted, but I could make out what looked like a face that was decidedly not human. I told myself I was seeing things, that it was just a trick of light and shadow, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut. Against my better judgment, I decided to set up a more sophisticated camera trap. If there was something out there, I was determined to get clear evidence of it. The next day, I hiked back out to my hunting spot, loaded down with high-end camera equipment. I set up multiple cameras with motion sensors and infrared capabilities. Whatever had triggered my trail cam, I was going to catch it on film. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual chatter of birds and squirrels conspicuously absent. More than once, I spun around, certain I'd heard something moving in the underbrush behind me, but each time I saw nothing but trees and shadows. I finished setting up the cameras just as the sun was starting to set. The fading light played tricks on my eyes, turning familiar shapes into looming monsters. I hurried back to my truck, eager to put some distance between myself and the increasingly eerie forest. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were filled with shadowy figures and glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, with an overwhelming urge to check my cameras. The drive back to my hunting spot seemed to take forever. As I hiked in, the morning mist clung to the trees, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of me. The forest was silent, save for the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own ragged breathing. When I reached the clearing where I'd set up my cameras, I stopped dead in my tracks. The area looked like a war zone. Trees were snapped and splintered, deep gouges carved into their trunks. My expensive camera equipment lay scattered and broken, as if something had torn through the area in a rage. With shaking hands, I gathered what I could salvage. Most of the cameras were beyond repair, their casings crushed and lenses shattered. But one, miraculously, seemed intact. I pocketed its memory card, not daring to view its contents there in the forest. As I surveyed the destruction, my eye caught something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in a patch of soft earth, was a footprint, but not like any animal print I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own boot, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe, and it was unmistakably bipedal. I took a few hasty photos with my phone, my hands trembling so badly I could barely hold it steady. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I didn't stick around to investigate. I ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I had to get out of there fast. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a tall, dark shape moving between the trees. But when I looked again, it was gone. The drive home was a blur. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The rational part of me insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a bear, driven to unusual behavior by lack of food, or perhaps some kind of elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew. Whatever had destroyed my cameras, whatever had left those impossible footprints, it was something beyond my understanding, something that shouldn't exist in the world as I knew it. When I finally got home, I locked the doors and drew the curtains before I dared to look at the memory card. My hands shook as I inserted it into my computer. Most of the files were corrupted, full of static and distorted images. But a few had survived. The first clear image nearly stopped my heart. There, in high-definition clarity, was a creature straight out of a nightmare. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was a disturbing mix of ape and man, with deep-set eyes that glowed eerily in the camera's infrared flash. Long arms ended in hands, not paws, but actual hands, with wickedly curved claws. The creature was examining one of my cameras, its head tilted in what looked unsettlingly like curiosity. In the next frame, its expression had changed to one of rage. The following images chronicled the destruction I'd witnessed in the clearing, the creature tearing through my equipment with terrifying strength. The final uncorrupted image was the most chilling. The creature was looking directly at the camera, its eyes seeming to stare right through the lens at me. There was intelligence in that gaze, and something else, a challenge, perhaps, or a warning. I spent the next few days in a daze, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. I pored over the images, zooming in on every detail, trying to convince myself that it was all an elaborate hoax. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. This was real. The question was, what do I do with this information? I thought about contacting the local authorities, but quickly dismissed the idea. Who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of the station, possibly even accused of fabricating evidence. I considered reaching out to cryptozoologists or paranormal investigators, but the thought of drawing attention to whatever this creature was gave me pause. What if by revealing its existence, I put it in danger? Or worse, what if I led others into those woods, only for them to meet a fate worse than destroyed cameras? In the end, I decided to keep my discovery to myself, at least for now. I encrypted the images and stored them on a secure hard drive, hidden away where no one would think to look for them. The footprint photos on my phone I deleted, after transferring them to the same hard drive. I haven't been hunting since that day. The thought of entering the woods, of being watched by unseen eyes, is more than I can bear. I've sold most of my gear, telling friends and family that I've lost interest in the sport. They don't understand, but it's better than trying to explain the unexplainable. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I pull out that hard drive and look at the images again. I study the creature's face, trying to understand what I'm seeing. Is it some kind of undiscovered primate, a relic from a prehistoric age, or something else entirely, something beyond our current scientific understanding? I may never know the truth, but one thing is certain: I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are things out there, just beyond the edge of our perception, that defy explanation. And sometimes, the hunter can become the hunted in ways we never imagined. So if you're planning a hunting trip, or even just a hike in the backcountry, remember this: the forest holds secrets. Be respectful, be cautious, and above all, be aware, because you never know when you might stumble upon something that will change your understanding of the world forever. As for me, I'll stick to target practice in controlled environments. The thrill of the hunt isn't worth the price of confronting the unknown. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some creatures better left undiscovered. The wilderness has its own rules, its own inhabitants, and not all of them welcome human intrusion. Story 22. I've been on countless search and rescue missions, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered in those mountains. What started as a routine operation to find a missing hiker turned into a descent into terror that still haunts my dreams. Some say there are places in this world where the veil between realities is thin. After that day, I'm inclined to believe them. It was supposed to be a standard search. A solo hiker, experienced but not overly so, had failed to return from a week-long trek through a remote area of the Rockies. His wife reported him missing when he didn't check in at their agreed time. Our team was called in to comb the area where his emergency beacon had last pinged. The first 2 days of the search were uneventful. We grid-searched the rugged terrain, calling out and listening for any response. The weather was on our side, clear skies and mild temperatures, but there was no sign of our missing hiker. It was on the 3rd day that things took a turn for the strange. We'd split into pairs to cover more ground, and my partner Jake and I were assigned to search a series of small canyons that cut through the mountainside. As we made our way along a narrow ledge, I noticed something odd about the rock face to our right. "Jake," I called out, "take a look at this." He backtracked to where I stood, shining his flashlight on the area I was examining. There, etched into the stone, were a series of symbols unlike anything I'd ever seen. They weren't native petroglyphs or graffiti from modern hikers. These markings seemed older, somehow more primal. "What do you make of that?" Jake asked. His voice hushed. I shook my head, running my fingers over the strange carvings. "No idea. But look, they seemed to lead somewhere." Sure enough, the symbols formed a trail along the rock face, disappearing around a bend in the canyon. We followed, our curiosity overriding our mission for the moment. As we rounded the corner, we both stopped short. There, hidden in a recess of the canyon wall, was the entrance to a cave, but it wasn't a natural formation. The opening was perfectly round, its edges smoothed as if carved by expert hands. And surrounding it were more of those bizarre symbols, spiraling out from the entrance in an intricate pattern. "Should we call this in?" Jake asked, but I could hear the excitement in his voice. We were both experienced cavers, and the lure of an unexplored cavern was hard to resist. "Let's take a quick look," I said, already pulling out my caving gear. The missing hiker might have sought shelter here. We geared up and approached the entrance. As we got closer, I felt an odd sensation, like a change in air pressure. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the unsettling feeling that we were being watched. The beam of my headlamp cut through the darkness as we entered the cave. The tunnel was surprisingly smooth, its walls polished to an almost glassy finish. Our footsteps echoed strangely, the sound seeming to come from all directions at once. We'd gone about 100 yards when Jake suddenly grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I listened intently. At first, all I could hear was the sound of our own breathing, but then I caught it, a faint whisper, like someone talking just at the edge of hearing. I couldn't make out words, but the cadence was unmistakably speech-like. "Hello," I called out, my voice bouncing off the walls. "Is anyone there?" "We're with search and rescue," The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Jake and I exchanged uneasy glances. Something about this place felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. We pressed on, the tunnel gradually widening into a large chamber. Our lights revealed walls covered in more of those strange symbols, some glowing faintly with an otherworldly phosphorescence. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pillar carved with spiraling patterns that seemed to move when you didn't look directly at them. "What is this place?" Jake breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Before I could answer, a low rumble filled the chamber. At first, I thought it was the start of a cave-in, but then I realized the sound was coming from the pillar. It was vibrating, the patterns on its surface shifting and swirling with increasing speed. The whispering returned, louder now, coming from all around us. I spun in circles, trying to locate the source, but it seemed to be emanating from the very walls of the cave. And then, to my horror, I began to understand some of the words. Not, belong, go back. "Jake," I said, my voice tight with fear. "I think we need to leave now." But Jake wasn't listening. He was staring transfixed at the pillar, which had begun to emit a soft, pulsing light. As I watched, he took a step towards it, his hand outstretched. "Jake, no!" I shouted, lunging to grab him. The moment my hand touched his shoulder, everything went to hell. The whispering rose to a deafening roar, the symbols on the walls flaring with blinding light. The ground beneath our feet began to shake violently, and I could hear the sound of rocks splitting and cracking. I grabbed Jake's arm and ran, dragging him behind me. He seemed to snap out of his trance, stumbling along as we raced back down the tunnel. Behind us, I could hear something moving, something big. The walls themselves seemed to be closing in, the smooth surfaces becoming rough and jagged. We burst out of the cave entrance just as a massive tremor shook the mountainside. Rocks rained down around us as we scrambled to safety. When the dust settled, we turned to look back. The cave entrance was gone, sealed by a rockfall as if it had never existed. Jake and I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. When we finally gathered ourselves enough to call it in, we decided to omit the stranger details from our report. Who would believe us anyway? The search for the missing hiker continued for another week before being called off. No trace of him was ever found. Sometimes I wonder if he stumbled upon that cave, if he's still in there somewhere, trapped in whatever impossible space we glimpsed. In the years since, I've researched obsessively, looking for any mention of similar caves or symbols. I've found whispers, fragments of stories from various cultures about hidden places where reality bends, where things from beyond our understanding dwell, but nothing concrete, nothing that fully explains what we experienced. I still work search and rescue, but I've never gone back to that part of the mountains. The memory of those whispering voices, of the way the cave seemed alive and aware, is enough to keep me away. Jake left the service not long after our experience. Last I heard, he'd moved to the city, as far from the wilderness as he could get. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whistles just right, I think I can hear those whispers again. They call to me, urging me to return, to uncover the secrets hidden in that impossible cave. But I resist. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened. So if you're out hiking in the backcountry and you come across strange symbols carved into stone, or a cave entrance that seems too perfect to be natural, my advice is this: turn back. The wilderness holds secrets older than humanity, forces beyond our comprehension, and not all of them are benign. As for me, I'll stick to well-mapped caves and familiar trails. The thrill of discovery isn't worth the price of confronting the unknown, because out there, in the deepest, darkest parts of the world, there are things waiting, things that whisper in forgotten languages and dwell in places where reality itself bends to their will. And if you find yourself lost in the mountains, with night falling and strange sounds all around, remember this: not all who wander are lost, but some who are lost never return. Some caves are better left unexplored, some mysteries better left unsolved. The world is wider and stranger than we can imagine, and not all of its wonders welcome human intrusion. Story 23. As a wildlife biologist, I've spent my career studying the intricate balance of nature, but nothing in my years of research could have prepared me for the terror I encountered in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. What began as a routine study of animal behavior turned into a nightmare that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It started with subtle changes. The forest, usually teeming with life, had grown unnaturally quiet. The familiar chatter of birds and scurrying of small mammals had been replaced by an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. At first, I attributed it to natural fluctuations in wildlife populations, but as days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. My research focused on the interactions between predator and prey species in the area. I had set up a network of trail cameras and tracking stations throughout a 5-square-mile section of the forest. Each day, I'd hike out to check the equipment and collect data, but lately, the cameras were coming up empty, showing nothing but vacant forest trails. It was on the 5th day of this unusual silence that I noticed something odd about the animal tracks I did find. They all seemed to be heading in the same direction, away from a particular area of the forest. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, I decided to investigate. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The air felt thick, almost electric, as if a storm was brewing. But the sky above the canopy remained clear and blue. I had been walking for about an hour when I came across the first downed tree. It was a massive old-growth fir, its trunk easily 5 feet in diameter. But what caught my attention wasn't its size, but the way it had fallen. The break wasn't clean like you'd see from lightning or wind damage. Instead, the trunk was splintered and twisted, as if something had physically wrenched it from the ground. Puzzled, I continued on, only to find more trees in similar states of destruction. It looked like a tornado had torn through the area, but the damage was strangely localized, and then I saw the claw marks. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, there was no denying what I was seeing. Deep gouges ran along the trunks of several trees, some nearly a foot long and inches deep. My mind raced, trying to match these marks to any known predator in the region. Bears. No, too big and too high up the trunk. Mountain lions. The pattern was all wrong. I was so engrossed in examining the marks that I almost missed the sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, deep, primal, and undeniably threatening. My whole body tensed, instincts screaming at me to run, but years of field training kicked in, and I slowly, carefully turned to scan my surroundings. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially obscured by the underbrush, was a shape that defied explanation. It was massive, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, with a broad, muscular build. Thick, dark fur covered its body, and its head. I still have trouble describing its head. It was a disturbing mix of ursine and primate features, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The creature and I locked gazes, and I felt the weight of its stare like a physical force. There was curiosity in those eyes, but also something else. A warning, perhaps, or a challenge. Then, faster than something that size should be able to move, it was gone. One moment it was there, the next it had vanished into the forest, leaving nothing but a rustling of leaves in its wake. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Part of me wanted to pursue, to catch another glimpse of the impossible creature I'd just seen. But a more primal part knew better. Whatever that thing was, it was apex predator, and I was in its territory. I made it back to my research station in record time, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every snapping twig. As soon as I was inside, I locked the door and started poring over my reference books, searching for any mention of a creature that could match what I'd seen. Hours passed, and I found nothing concrete. There were legends, of course. Native American tales of forest giants and shape-shifting beasts, cryptozoological accounts of Bigfoot and other undiscovered primates, but nothing that fully explained the creature I'd encountered. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, but these weren't the normal nocturnal noises I was used to. The howls and screams that echoed through the darkness were like nothing I'd ever heard before. They spoke of things ancient and primal, of a wilderness far wilder than we'd ever imagined. I didn't sleep that night. How could I, with those sounds outside and the memory of those glowing eyes burned into my mind? As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I made a decision. I had to go back. I had to find proof. I packed my gear methodically: camera, plaster for casting tracks, sample collection kit. Part of me knew this was madness, that I should be calling in backup or getting as far away from this forest as possible. But the scientist in me, the part that had dedicated my life to understanding the natural world, couldn't walk away from this discovery. The hike back to the area of destruction seemed to take forever. Every shadow held a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a harbinger of that massive shape emerging to confront me. But I pressed on, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination. When I reached the clearing with the downed trees, I set to work immediately. I photographed the claw marks, took measurements, and started to make a cast of one of the clearer prints I found in a patch of soft earth. I was so focused on my task that I almost missed the change in the atmosphere. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the leaves. And then I felt it, that same electric charge in the air that I'd experienced the day before. I stood slowly, my hand tightening around the canister of bear spray on my belt. As I turned, I saw them. Not one creature this time, but three. They stood at the edge of the clearing, their massive forms casting long shadows in the morning light. For a long moment, we regarded each other. I could see intelligence in their eyes, an awareness that went beyond mere animal instinct. They were assessing me, just as I was them. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental about nature, about the world we think we know so well. We are not alone. There are things out there, creatures that have existed alongside us for millennia, carefully keeping to the shadows, avoiding human detection. This wasn't just an undiscovered species. This was something more, something that challenged our very understanding of evolution and natural history. One of the creatures took a step forward, and I tensed, ready to flee or fight. But instead of attacking, it lifted its head and let out a long, mournful call. The sound reverberated through the clearing, filled with a sadness and longing that was almost human. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. They melted back into the forest with a grace that belied their size, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and half-finished plaster cast. I'd love to say that I stayed, that I continued my research and brought definitive proof of these creatures back to the scientific community. But the truth is, I ran. I packed up my equipment with shaking hands and hiked out of that forest as fast as my legs would carry me. In the years since, I've grappled with what to do with my experience. I've pored over my photos and notes, debated coming forward with my story, but every time I consider it, I remember that mournful call, that sense of ancient sadness, and I wonder if some secrets are meant to be kept. I still work as a wildlife biologist, but I've shifted my focus to more urban environments. The deep wilderness holds no allure for me anymore, because now I know that when you venture into the heart of the forest, you're not at the top of the food chain. There are things out there, creatures beyond our understanding, that have called those woods home long before we ever set foot in them. So if you find yourself in the backcountry and the forest suddenly goes quiet, pay attention. If you see claw marks too big to be explained, or hear sounds that defy description, don't investigate. Turn back, because some discoveries come with a price, and some creatures are better left undisturbed. As for me, I'll stick to city parks and controlled nature preserves. The mysteries of the deep forest can keep their secrets. Because out there, in the oldest, wildest parts of the world, there are things watching and waiting, and not all of them want to be found. Story 24. I've been an avid fisherman for over 3 decades, but nothing in all my years of angling could have prepared me for that night at Whisper Lake. What started as a peaceful fishing trip turned into an encounter that shook me to my very core and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the natural world. My buddy Frank and I had been planning this trip for months. Whisper Lake was notorious among local fishing circles, not for its abundance of fish, but for its remote location and the challenges it presented. Accessible only by a grueling 5-mile hike through dense forest, it wasn't a destination for the faint of heart, but the promise of monster trout and the allure of pristine wilderness was too much for us to resist. We set out at dawn, our packs heavy with camping gear and fishing equipment. The hike was as brutal as we'd been warned, the trail often disappearing into tangles of underbrush that we had to fight our way through. By the time we caught our first glimpse of Whisper Lake, the sun was already dipping towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The lake itself was a sight to behold. Crystal clear water reflected the surrounding pines like a mirror, broken only by the occasional ripple from jumping fish. We quickly set up camp on a small clearing near the shore, eager to get our lines in the water before darkness fell. As night settled in, we sat by our small campfire, enjoying the fruits of our labor, 2 decent-sized trout sizzling on a makeshift spit. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the gentle lapping of waves on the shore. It was the kind of peace you can only find miles away from civilization. "You smell that?" Frank suddenly asked, his nose wrinkling. I sniffed the air, catching a whiff of something pungent and musky. "They're probably just a deer or something," I said, though the odor was unlike anything I'd encountered before. Frank nodded, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Truth be told, I felt it too, a growing sense of discomfort, as if we were being watched from the darkness beyond our firelight. We turned in early, crawling into our tent with plans for a pre-dawn fishing start. But sleep didn't come easy. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge, and always there was that strange, musky odor growing stronger as the night wore on. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I heard it, the sound of something large moving through the water. At first, I thought it might be a moose or elk coming to drink, but the splashing was too rhythmic, too deliberate. "Frank," I whispered, nudging my friend awake. "You hear that?" He grunted, rolling over in his sleeping bag. "Probably just a fish jumping. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The sight that greeted me is one I'll never forget. There, at the water's edge, no more than 30 yards away, stood a creature that defied explanation. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I recognized. It stood on 2 legs, its posture unnervingly human-like. As my flashlight beam played across its form, the creature turned, and I found myself staring into eyes that reflected the light with an eerie, reddish glow. They were intelligent eyes, filled with the awareness that sent a chill down my spine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The creature and I locked gazes, and I felt the weight of its stare like a physical force. There was curiosity in those eyes, but also something else, a wildness, a primal intensity that spoke of things beyond human understanding. Then, faster than something that size should be able to move, it was gone. One moment it was there, the next it had vanished into the forest, leaving nothing but ripples on the lake's surface. "Frank!" I hissed, my voice shaking. "Get up! You've got to see this!" But by the time Frank stumbled out of the tent, there was nothing to see but the peaceful lake and the dark line of trees. "What's going on?" he asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words sounded hollow, inadequate to describe the impossible creature I'd encountered. Frank listened, his expression moving from confusion to concern. "Maybe it was just a bear," he suggested, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, we sat by the rekindled fire, jumping at every sound from the forest. The musky odor lingered, stronger now, a constant reminder that something unnatural was out there in the darkness. As the first light of dawn broke over the trees, we made a mutual decision to cut our trip short. Whatever I had seen, whatever was out there, had robbed the wilderness of its appeal. We packed up camp in record time, our eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Just as we were about to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There at the edge of our campsite was a footprint, but not like any animal print I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with distinct claw marks at the end of each toe. And it was unmistakably bipedal. I called Frank over, and we stood there in stunned silence, staring at the impossible print. It was proof that I hadn't imagined the creature, that something truly unexplainable had visited our camp in the night. "We should report this," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. But as I looked at that footprint, I felt a strange reluctance. Who would believe us? And more importantly, did we have the right to expose whatever this creature was to the world? In the end, we decided to keep our encounter to ourselves. We took a few hasty photos of the print with our phones, then obliterated it with dirt and leaves. The hike back to civilization was tense, both of us constantly looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see that massive, furry form emerge from the trees. In the years since that night at Whisper Lake, I've grappled with what to do with our experience. I've researched cryptozoology, pored over Native American legends, and even reached out to a few trusted friends in the scientific community. But I've never found a satisfactory explanation for what we encountered. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window, I find myself thinking about that creature. Was it some kind of undiscovered primate? A relic from a prehistoric age, or something else entirely, something beyond our current scientific understanding? I may never know the truth, but one thing is certain: I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are things out there, just beyond the edge of our perception, that defy explanation. And sometimes, when we venture into the deepest parts of the wild, we become the ones being observed. I still fish, but these days I stick to well-traveled lakes and rivers. The call of remote wilderness has lost its allure. Because now I know that when you cast your line into those pristine, isolated waters, you never know what might be watching from the shore. So if you're planning a camping trip to some remote lake, remember this: the wilderness holds secrets. Be respectful, be cautious, and above all, be aware, because you never know when you might encounter something that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the natural world. As for me, I'll stick to the familiar waters close to home. The thrill of catching a monster trout isn't worth the price of confronting the unknown. Some lakes are better left unexplored, some creatures better left undiscovered. The wilderness has its own rules, its own inhabitants, and not all of them welcome human intrusion.